I stand at the edge of an idea, and the idea is vast, stretching backward through millennia, through dust and memory, through layers of earth that hold the whispers of something ancient, something foundational. There is a place that exists now only in fragments, in clay tablets pressed with wedge-shaped marks, in the geometric patterns of sun-dried brick, in the ghost lines of canals that once carried water through an impossible garden. And tonight, I find myself drawn there, not as a visitor, but as a witness to the slow accumulation of human thought, human ambition, human need. The land between two rivers, that is what the name means. Mesopotamia, from the Greek words for middle and river, though the people who lived there first would not have called it that. They would have known it simply as the world, as the black-headed people, as Sumer, as Akkad, as Babylonia, as the place where the Tigris and Euphrates descend from distant mountains and spread their gift of silt across an otherwise unyielding plain. I imagine standing there in that river valley, 5,000 years removed from electric light, from the hum of engines, from any sound except wind and water and the occasional bleating of sheep in the distance. And I see how the landscape itself is both generous and demanding, how it floods with seasonal precision, depositing rich, dark earth, then recedes, leaving behind the challenge of survival in a place where rain is scarce and summer heat is merciless. The rivers move slowly, their surfaces catching the bronze light of late afternoon, reflecting palm trees that cluster along the banks like patient guardians. And beyond the green ribbon of vegetation, the land extends in shades of ochre and pale gold, flat, seemingly endless, holding secrets in its silence. This is where it began, not all of it, but so much of what we consider the architecture of civilization, the framework upon which cities and laws and literature would be built. And the beginning was not sudden, not a single moment of revelation, but rather a gradual accumulation, like sediment settling, layer upon layer, generation upon generation. I think about the first settlements, small clusters of reed houses near the water's edge, people who had learned to plant barley and emmer wheat in the rich soil left by the floods, who had domesticated sheep and goats and cattle, who were beginning to understand that staying in one place, building something permanent, might be possible, might be preferable to the endless movement of the nomadic life. The sun moves across the sky, and with it, the shadows lengthen over mud brick walls that rise higher each generation, over temples that begin as simple shrines and grow into massive stepped pyramids called ziggurats, over marketplaces where goods from distant mountains and far coasts change hands, copper and lapis lazuli and timber and stone. There is something hypnotic about imagining the rhythm of life in these early cities, the way the day would begin before dawn with the lighting of fires, the preparation of bread, the opening of workshops where craftsmen shaped clay and hammered metal and wove textiles, the way the streets would fill with voices speaking Sumerian, later Akkadian, languages that sound in my mind like water over stones, unfamiliar, musical, carrying the weight of human need and human wonder. I see the scribes seated in the shade of a courtyard, reed styluses in hand, pressing wedge shapes into soft clay tablets, recording grain deliveries, temple offerings, the terms of a marriage contract, the boundaries of a field, and in doing so, creating something unprecedented, a memory outside the human body, a way to speak across time. The cuneiform signs emerge from the clay like constellations, each one a small constellation of marks, triangular impressions that represent not just objects, but sounds, syllables, the building blocks of language made visible, made permanent. And with this technology, this profound invention, the interior life of ancient Mesopotamia begins to reveal itself, not just in administrative records, but in poetry, in prayers, in letters between fathers and sons, in the epic tale of a king who sought immortality and found instead the value of a well-built wall. Night falls over the river valley, and the darkness is complete, except for oil lamps flickering in windows, torches carried by night watchmen, the distant glow of a temple where priests maintain the eternal flame, and above it all, stars so bright and numerous they seem almost close enough to touch, the same stars that Mesopotamian astronomers observed and catalogued with astonishing precision, tracking the movements of planets, predicting eclipses, mapping the heavens with the same meticulous attention they brought to mapping the earth. This is where I begin, in the presence of that ancient darkness, that ancient light, listening for the echoes of voices that spoke of gods and kings, of floods and harvests, of justice and revenge, of love and death, voices that shaped the first written words, the first cities, the first codes of law, voices that still resonate, faint but unmistakable across the enormous distance of time. The story begins much earlier than the cities, begins in a time when the southern plains of Mesopotamia were still marshland and estuary, when the Persian Gulf extended much farther north than it does today, and the people who would eventually become the Sumerians were perhaps still migrating, still searching for a place to settle, their origins obscured by the very success of what they would build. We do not know where they came from, these people who called themselves the black-headed ones, their language unrelated to any other known tongue, standing alone like an island in a sea of Semitic speech. And this linguistic isolation is one of the great mysteries, a question that remains suspended in the space between evidence and imagination. But what we do know is that by around 5,000 years ago, perhaps a few centuries earlier, they were there in the southernmost reaches of the river valley, building something unprecedented. The first settlements were humble, built of bundled reeds plastered with mud, structures that echoed the materials at hand, the papyrus-like reeds that grew in dense thickets along the waterways, and even later, when they learned to make bricks from the river mud. They continued to build with those bundles of reeds incorporated into the design, remembered in the ribbed columns of later temples, architectural memory of origins. Eridu, that is the name that appears in the king lists as the first city, the place where kingship descended from heaven, and archaeological evidence confirms human habitation. They're going back, perhaps, 7,000 years, layer upon layer of rebuilding. Temples constructed atop the ruins of earlier temples, each generation raising the sacred platform a little higher, creating over millennia the artificial mountain that would become the signature form of Mesopotamian worship. I imagine the early farmers working the fields in the cooler hours of morning and evening, understanding already that water was everything, that the rivers gave life but also took it away, that floods could destroy as easily as they nourished, and so they began to dig, simple channels at first, directing water where it was needed, keeping it away from where it would do harm. And these first tentative attempts at irrigation would evolve into something extraordinary, a network of canals and dikes and reservoirs that transformed the landscape, that made civilization possible. By the 4th millennium before the Common Era, settlements were growing into towns, and towns into cities. Uruk rising from the plain like a declaration, its population swelling to perhaps 50,000 people, an almost incomprehensible concentration of humanity for that time, surrounded by 6 miles of defensive walls, dotted with temples whose facades were decorated with colored clay cones pressed into the mud brick to create geometric patterns, red and white and black, glittering in the harsh sunlight. The temple complexes dominated these early cities, vast estates dedicated to the gods, and it was here that the innovations emerged, the need to track offerings, to record the distribution of grain and oil and wool to temple workers, to manage the increasingly complex economy of a settled agricultural society. And this need gave birth to the first writing. The earliest tablets are simple, pictographic. A circle with a cross means sheep. A bowl shape means food or bread. Symbols that represent the objects themselves. But already there is something revolutionary happening, the human mind externalizing its memory, creating a technology that will outlast flesh and bone, that will speak across the silent gulf of death. I see the first scribes, perhaps temple administrators, realizing that these marks could represent not just things but sounds, that the symbol for water could also mean the sound A in the Sumerian language. And with this insight, this leap of abstraction, writing became capable of recording anything, not just inventories, but also stories, prayers, laws, the full complexity of human thought. The cities multiplied, Ur and Lagash and Nippur, Kish and Umma and Larsa, each with its own patron deity, its own agricultural hinterland, its own ambitions. And between them, the relationship was sometimes cooperative, sometimes violently competitive. Wars fought over water rights, over boundary stones, over the favor of the gods. And from these conflicts, from the need to organize labor for irrigation projects and defense, came the institution of kingship. The earliest kings were perhaps war leaders, men who proved themselves in battle and then retained authority in peacetime, or they were temple administrators who accumulated enough power to rule in both sacred and secular spheres. And the line between these roles was never clear. The king was always, in some sense, the representative of the gods, the intermediary between heaven and earth, responsible for maintaining Mahat, the cosmic order, ensuring that the rituals were performed correctly, that justice was administered, that the walls were strong. The king lists speak of dynasties lasting thousands of years, of rulers who reigned for impossible spans, 36,000 years, 28,800 years, and then, after a great flood, the lengths become more reasonable, more human, and scholars debate whether these early fantastic numbers represent real chronology, compressed and mythologized, or whether they are purely symbolic, expressions of the feeling that time itself was different once, deeper, more sacred. The flood appears again and again in Mesopotamian literature, a catastrophe that divided history, that washed away an earlier world, and whether it refers to a specific historical event, perhaps a devastating inundation around 5,000 years ago, or whether it represents the accumulated memory of countless floods, the existential threat of living between two powerful rivers, the story itself became foundational. The righteous man warned by his God, building a boat, saving the animals, surviving the deluge that was meant to destroy humanity for its noise, its chaos, its failure to properly revere the divine. By the early third millennium, the cities had developed distinct identities. Uruk was a center of craft production and trade, its workshops producing pottery and textiles that spread throughout the region. Ur became wealthy from commerce, its position near the coast, giving it access to goods from the Persian Gulf and beyond. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian from India, copper from Oman, and Nippur held religious authority, its temple to Enlil, the chief god, making it a pilgrimage site, a neutral ground where kings from rival cities could meet and negotiate. The irrigation systems grew more sophisticated, more extensive, main canals feeding into smaller channels, water distributed according to complex schedules and regulations. And this required coordination, required authority, required a bureaucracy capable of managing the flow of water and the disputes that inevitably arose when one city's use affected another's supply. And so the practical necessities of survival in an arid land shaped the political structures, created the need for law, for record keeping, for the apparatus of state. I imagine walking through Uruk in its glory, through streets that follow no grid, winding organically between tightly packed houses, walls rising directly from the narrow alleys, the ground floor windowless for security and coolness. The upper stories sometimes projecting over the street, creating patches of shade, and the houses themselves built around central courtyards, open to the sky, where families cooked and worked and slept under the stars in summer. The sounds would be the sounds of craft, of commerce, the rhythmic pounding of copper being hammered into shape, the clack of the vertical loom as a weaver works, voices haggling over the price of dates or barley, children playing games with knucklebones, and underlying it all, the murmur of water flowing through the city's canals, the lifeline that makes all of this possible. In the temples, priests performed the daily rituals, clothing the statue of the god, offering food and drink, burning incense, maintaining the relationship between the human and divine realms that ensured fertility, prosperity, victory. And these weren't merely symbolic acts. They were understood as essential maintenance, as necessary as repairing a breach in a canal wall. The cosmos required constant attention, constant propitiation, or it would fall back into chaos. The gods themselves were numerous, each city's patron deity, supreme in their own territory but acknowledged as part of a larger pantheon. And the sky god, Enlil the lord of wind and storm, Enki the god of fresh water and wisdom, Inanna the goddess of love and war. Complex personalities prone to jealousy and anger and occasional mercy, divine beings who mirrored human society, who had families and rivalries and councils, who could be influenced by offerings and prayers, or who might simply act according to their own inscrutable will. And alongside the worship, alongside the daily labor of farming and craft, there was already art, already literature, the cylinder seals carved with intricate scenes, banquets and battles and processions, pressed into wet clay to mark ownership or authority, and poetry, hymns to the gods composed with sophisticated literary techniques, parallelism and repetition and illusion, verses that were performed, chanted in temple ceremonies, preserved on tablets for other scribes to copy and study. This was the foundation, the early phase when the fundamental patterns were established, when humanity was learning to live in unprecedented density, creating the institutions and technologies and cultural forms that would define not just Mesopotamia but all subsequent civilizations, the city, the state, the written word, the law code, the epic poem, all emerging from the silt between two rivers, from the ingenuity born of necessity, from the slow accumulation of knowledge passed from generation to generation, each one building on what came before, raising the platform a little higher, creating something that would endure long after the rivers changed course and the cities fell silent. The transition from the early dynastic period into what scholars call the Akkadian Empire marks a profound shift, not just in political organization, but in the very conception of what power could mean, what territory could encompass. And this transformation centers on a single figure whose historicity is debated, but whose impact is undeniable. Sargon of Akkad, a name that means true king and may itself be a title rather than a birth name, a man who rose from obscurity to create something unprecedented. The legends say he was born in secret, placed in a reed basket and set adrift on the river, discovered and raised by a gardener, later becoming cupbearer to the king of Kish. And whether these details are historical or borrowed from mythic archetypes, they speak to the revolutionary nature of his rise, a commoner who seized power, who unified the squabbling city-states under a single authority, who extended his control from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, creating the first true empire in human history. Around 4,300 years ago, give or take a century, Sargon established his capital at Akkad, a city whose exact location remains unknown despite centuries of searching, buried somewhere beneath the alluvial plain, its name surviving in the language that became the lingua franca of Mesopotamia for the next 2 millennia, Akkadian, a Semitic tongue that coexisted with Sumerian, gradually replacing it in daily speech, while Sumerian persisted as the language of scholarship and ritual. Like Latin in medieval Europe, the empire Sargon built required new technologies of administration, new ways of projecting power across distance, and so the apparatus of state grew more sophisticated. Royal inscriptions carved in stone proclaimed his victories, his justice, his divine mandate, and these inscriptions were written in both Sumerian and Akkadian, a political statement as much as a practical one, honoring the old while asserting the new. I imagine the armies marching, soldiers equipped with bows and spears and axes, organized into units, supplied by a logistics system that could move grain and water across hostile terrain, conquering cities that had never known foreign rule, installing governors loyal to Sargon, demanding tribute, and with conquest came trade, goods flowing along protected routes, merchants moving freely under the king's authority, wealth accumulating in Akkad and redistributed to maintain the military, the bureaucracy, the monumental building projects that proclaimed imperial glory. But empires are fragile, maintained by constant effort, and when Sargon died, his sons and grandsons struggled to hold what he had won. Rebellions flared in the Sumerian cities, resentful of Akkadian dominance, and it took ruthless suppression to maintain control. Entire cities destroyed as examples, populations deported, the inscription of Sargon's grandson Naram-Sin describing how he defeated a coalition of rebellious kings, how he claimed divinity for himself, wearing the horned crown previously reserved for gods, and having his image carved on victory steles showing him trampling enemies underfoot, ascending a mountain with the stars of the gods shining above. The Akkadian Empire lasted perhaps a century and a half, and its collapse was sudden, catastrophic, caused by a combination of internal rebellion and external invasion, raids by the Gutians from the Zagros Mountains, and possibly, though this remains debated, by climate change, a severe drought that may have driven pastoral peoples from the surrounding steppes into the fertile river valley, creating a cascade of migrations and conflicts that the imperial structure could not withstand. In the chaos that followed, power devolved back to the city-states, but the idea of empire had been planted, the memory of unified rule under a single king, and after a period of fragmentation, the Sumerian cities experienced a renaissance, particularly which emerged as the dominant power around 4,100 years ago, establishing what scholars call the Third Dynasty of Ur, or Ur-3, a period of extraordinary cultural achievement and bureaucratic complexity. The kings of Ur-3 recreated many aspects of the Akkadian state, but with a Sumerian identity, a conscious revival of older traditions expressed in art and architecture and official language, the great ziggurat of Ur rising in tiers of baked brick, its corners oriented to the cardinal directions, its massive form visible for miles across the flat plain. An artificial mountain connecting earth to heaven, the dwelling place of Nana, the moon god, and around it the temple complex with its workshops and storerooms and administrative offices, the economic heart of the state. The bureaucracy of Ur-3 was astonishingly detailed. We have tens of thousands of clay tablets recording the minutiae of temple and state administration, receipts for livestock, ration distributions, work assignments, each transaction documented by scribes who spent years learning the complex cuneiform system, mastering not just the signs, but the formulaic language of administration, the proper way to record a delivery of wool or an assignment of laborers to canal maintenance. I see the archive rooms, shelves stacked with tablets, some still soft and needing to be dried, others already baked hard by time or accident, each one a tiny fragment of the vast informational apparatus that kept the state functioning, that tracked resources from production to consumption, that made it possible to feed and clothe thousands of workers, to plan agricultural cycles, to prepare for festivals, to maintain the infrastructure of canals and walls and roads. The legal system, too, became more codified, building on earlier traditions, establishing principles that would echo through later law codes, the presumption that crimes could be atoned through compensation rather than vengeance, that contracts must be witnessed and recorded, that even the powerful could be held accountable to written standards, though, of course, the reality often fell short of the ideal. Justice available more readily to those with resources and connections. Women in this society occupied complex positions. Elite women could own property, conduct business, serve as priestesses, some even ruled as regents. But the general trend over time was toward increasing restrictions, increasing emphasis on patriarchal control, marriage contracts that treated women as property to be exchanged, divorce laws that heavily favored men, And yet within these constraints, individual women found ways to exercise agency, to accumulate wealth, to influence the powerful men in their lives. The scribal schools, called eduba or tablet houses, trained boys from elite families in the arts of writing and calculation, an education that could take years, beginning with copying simple signs, progressing to syllabaries and word lists, mathematical tables and legal formulae, and finally to literature, the great works of Sumerian poetry and wisdom, students copying the same texts generation after generation, preserving them, and in the process creating a literary canon, a shared cultural heritage that transcended individual cities. Among the texts they copied were hymns, prayers addressed to various gods, praising their attributes, requesting their favor, and myths, stories of creation and cosmic battle, the tale of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, of Inanna's descent to the underworld, narratives that explain the nature of reality, the relationship between gods and humans, the inevitability of death, and the importance of leaving a name, a reputation, something that would survive the body's dissolution. The astronomical observations continued and deepened, priests tracking the movements of Venus with extraordinary precision, recognizing patterns, understanding that celestial events could be predicted, compiled in omens lists that correlated heavenly phenomena with earthly outcomes. If Venus appears in such and such position, the king will die, the harvest will fail, the enemy will attack. And while we might dismiss this as superstition, it represented a sophisticated understanding that the universe operated according to regular patterns, that observation and record-keeping could reveal those patterns, a proto-scientific impulse, even if the causal framework was religious. Mathematics, too, flourished, the Mesopotamians using a sexagesimal system, base 60, which gave them great flexibility in calculation, allowing them to express fractions easily, to solve complex problems of land measurement and volume, and this mathematical tradition would survive, passing to the Greeks and eventually to us in the 60 minutes of an hour, the 60 seconds of a minute. The 360 degrees of a circle, inheritances from Mesopotamian scribes working by lamplight in temple offices 4,000 years ago. But the Ur-3 state, despite its sophistication, despite its elaborate systems of control and documentation, also collapsed, weakened by the same pressures that had destroyed Akkad, incursions by Amorite peoples from the west, internal rebellions, possibly environmental stress, and around 4,000 years ago, the last king of Ur was carried off into captivity, his city destroyed, and in the lamentations composed afterward, we hear genuine grief, a city personified as a woman weeping for her lost children, the temples abandoned, the gods departed, everything that seemed permanent revealed as fragile. Yet even in collapse there was continuity. The Amorites who conquered the Sumerian cities adopted Mesopotamian culture, learned cuneiform, worshipped the old gods alongside their own, established new dynasties in the old cities, and among these Babylon began its rise, a city that had been relatively minor, but whose location on the Euphrates, at the nexus of trade routes, Yasher gave it strategic importance, and under a series of capable rulers, it accumulated power, wealth, authority, preparing the ground for its greatest king. Hammurabi, ruling around 3,750 years ago, expanded Babylon's control methodically through diplomacy and warfare, conquering Mori and Larsa and Eshnunna, reunifying much of Mesopotamia under Babylonian authority, and while he was not the first to issue a law code, his is the most complete that survives, inscribed on a black stone stele, with the image of the king receiving authority from the sun, god Shamash. 282 laws covering everything from property rights to personal injury, from family relations to commercial transactions. The laws reveal a society stratified by class, different penalties for the same crime depending on whether the victim was a noble, a commoner, or a slave. The famous principle of an eye for an eye applying only within the same social tier, but they also show concern for the vulnerable, the widow and orphan, limits on the power of creditors, requirements that officials act justly or face severe penalties, an attempt, however imperfect, to create a predictable legal framework, to replace arbitrary power with written standards known to all. I imagine the stele standing in a public space, passers-by pausing to read, or more likely, to have read to them by a scribe, the laws that govern their lives, the protections they could claim, the obligations they must fulfill, and this publicness, this assertion that law should be visible and knowable, represents something profound, a check on tyranny, a foundation for social order based on more than force. Babylon under Hammurabi became a cultural center, its prestige attracting scholars and artists, its scribal schools preserving and creating literature, its temples serving as centers of learning, and the Babylonian dialect of Akkadian began to spread, becoming the language of diplomacy and scholarship throughout the Near East. Tablets from Egypt to Anatolia, written in Babylonian cuneiform, a testament to the soft power that accompanied military conquest. The city itself grew magnificent, though most of what we associate with Babylon, the Ishtar Gate, the Hanging Gardens, came much later. In Hammurabi's time, it was already substantial, surrounded by walls, divided by the Euphrates, temples rising above the mud-brick houses, markets bustling with merchants from distant lands, workshops producing the finest textiles and metalwork, and at the center, the palace complex where the king administered justice. Received ambassadors, planned campaigns, maintained the delicate balance of power that held the empire together. The empire Hammurabi built did not long survive his death. Within a generation, Babylon's control over the south weakened, and new powers emerged in the shifting landscape of alliances and conquests, the Kassites descending from the Zagros Mountains to establish a dynasty that would rule Babylon for 4 centuries, the longest-lasting dynasty in Mesopotamian history, and in the north, the kingdom of Mitanni rose to prominence, followed by the resurgence of Assyria, a city-state that had existed in the shadow of greater powers but would eventually surpass them all. The Kassites were outsiders, like the Amorites before them, but they too became Babylonianized, adopting the language and religion and administrative practices of the land they conquered, maintaining the temples, supporting the scribal schools, adding their own gods to the pantheon while honoring the old ones, and under their rule, Babylon remained a center of learning, its libraries preserving the literary heritage, its astronomers refining their observations, its mathematicians solving increasingly complex problems. Trade networks expanded during this period, reaching unprecedented distances. lapis lazuli from Afghanistan appearing in Egyptian tombs, amber from the Baltic found in Mesopotamian graves, tin from Central Asia, essential for bronze production, traveling along routes that connected civilizations from the Mediterranean to the Indus Valley. And with trade came cultural exchange, ideas moving along the same paths as goods, influencing art and architecture and religious thought in ways both obvious and subtle. But it was in the north, in Assyria, that the most dramatic developments unfolded. The Assyrian state had existed since the 3rd millennium, centered on the city of Ashur on the Tigris, named for its patron god, a trading hub that grew wealthy from commerce and gradually accumulated military power. And by the 14th century, before the Common Era, Assyria was challenging its neighbors, conquering territory, establishing the patterns of expansion and administration that would characterize its later empire. The Assyrians were warriors, their kings boasting in inscriptions of campaigns and conquests, of cities besieged and captured, of tribute extracted and rebels punished, and they developed military innovations that gave them decisive advantages, iron weapons when others still used bronze, cavalry alongside chariots, siege engines capable of breaching the strongest walls, and a logistical system that could supply armies in the field for extended campaigns, projecting power across vast distances. I imagine the Assyrian army on the march, columns of soldiers in bronze and leather armor, archers and spearmen, chariots raising dust, siege towers disassembled and carried on wagons, and behind them administrators and scribes, ready to organize the conquered territories, to assess tribute, to deport populations deemed unreliable, replacing them with people from other regions, a deliberate policy of mixing populations to prevent rebellion, to break local identities and create dependence on the central authority. The reliefs from Assyrian palaces show this military culture in vivid detail. Carved stone panels depicting battles and hunts, sieges with soldiers climbing ladders, enemies impaled or beheaded, royal lion hunts where the king demonstrates his courage and strength. And these weren't merely decorative, they were propaganda, assertions of power meant to impress visitors, to intimidate vassals, to glorify the king as the chosen of the gods, the bringer of order to a chaotic world. But Assyria was more than military might. Its capital cities, first Ashur, then Nimrud, then Khorsabad, finally Nineveh, became centers of culture and learning. Royal libraries collected tablets from throughout the empire, copies of ancient texts, contemporary scholarship, diplomatic correspondence. The great library of Ashur-banipal at Nineveh, containing perhaps 30,000 tablets, the largest collection in the ancient world, preserving works that would otherwise have been lost, including the most complete version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Ashur-banipal himself, ruling in the 7th century before the Common Era, was unusual among Assyrian kings for his scholarly interests. He boasted of his ability to read ancient Sumerian and complex cuneiform, of his knowledge of mathematics and divination, and he actively collected texts, sending scribes throughout the empire to copy works for his library, creating a repository of knowledge that attempted to gather all the wisdom of Mesopotamia in one place. The empire reached its greatest extent under Ashur-banipal, stretching from Egypt to the Persian Gulf, from the Mediterranean to the Iranian plateau, and the administrative machinery required to govern such territory was extraordinarily complex. Provinces ruled by governors reporting to the king, a network of roads with stations for royal messengers, an intelligence system that kept the court informed of events in distant regions, and elaborate rituals and ceremonies that reinforced the king's authority. His role as the representative of Ashur, the god who commanded conquest, who demanded tribute and obedience, yet even at its height, the empire contained the seeds of its collapse. The constant warfare exhausted resources. The deportations created resentment. The bureaucracy became unwieldy. And when external pressures mounted, when new enemies appeared, the structure proved brittle, unable to adapt. And in the final decades of the 7th century before the Common Era, everything fell apart with shocking speed. The Medes from the Iranian plateau allied with the Babylonians, who had chafed under Assyrian domination for generations, and together they destroyed the Assyrian heartland. Nimrud fell, then Ashur. Finally Nineveh in 612 before the Common Era. The great city burned so thoroughly that its ruins would lay hidden for millennia, and with its fall, the Assyrian Empire vanished, its military might, its administrative sophistication, its cultural achievements, all consumed in the conflagration of revenge. But from the ashes, Babylon rose again, greater than before, the Neo-Babylonian Empire under Nabopolassar, and his son Nebuchadnezzar expanding to control much of what Assyria had held. And Nebuchadnezzar transformed Babylon into the most magnificent city of the ancient world, the double walls so thick that chariots could race atop them, the Ishtar Gate covered in blue-glazed bricks with images of lions and dragons and bulls, the ziggurat of Marduk rising in 7 tiers, perhaps the inspiration for the Tower of Babel, and possibly, though evidence is uncertain, the hanging gardens, terraced and irrigated, a green wonder in the desert heat. The Babylonians of this era were conscious inheritors of a long tradition. They collected ancient texts, restored old temples, traced their legitimacy back through centuries of history, and they developed astronomy to new heights, systematic observations over decades, mathematical models that could predict planetary positions and eclipses with remarkable accuracy. The beginnings of a true science, observation leading to hypothesis, leading to prediction, leading to refinement. I see the astronomers on the ziggurat, night after night, tracking stars across the sky, recording positions with patient precision, and in the temple libraries, scholars compiling this data, looking for patterns, creating tables, understanding that the cosmos operated according to mathematical principles, that the apparent chaos of heavenly movements concealed deep regularities. And this knowledge had practical applications: agricultural, timing, festival scheduling, and political. The ability to predict eclipses gave priests and kings powerful tools for maintaining authority. But the Neo-Babylonian Empire was brief, barely a century, before a new power emerged. The Persians under Cyrus sweeping west from Iran, and in 539 before the Common Era, Babylon opened its gates without a fight, Cyrus entering peacefully, proclaiming himself liberator rather than conqueror, and Mesopotamia became a province, a satrapy of a larger empire, governed from distant capitals. Its independence ended, though its culture remained influential. Under Persian rule, then Macedonian after Alexander's conquest, then Seleucid Greek, then Parthian, The cities of Mesopotamia gradually declined. The irrigation systems deteriorated without central maintenance. The canals silted up. Salt accumulated in the soil from millennia of irrigation, reducing fertility, and populations drifted away to new centers of power, to Damascus and Alexandria and Antioch, the old cities contracting, some abandoned entirely. Cuneiform, which had recorded human thought for 3,000 years, was gradually replaced, first by Aramaic, written in alphabetic script, easier to learn, more flexible, then by Greek, and the last datable cuneiform tablet comes from the 1st century of the Common Era, an astronomical text, the final whisper of a tradition that stretched back to the dawn of writing, and, with its passing, the ability to read the accumulated wisdom of millennia was lost, the tablets becoming incomprehensible artifacts, dead voices waiting in darkness for someone to decipher their speech. The Mesopotamian gods lingered longer, worshipped in some places into the early centuries of the Common Era. But Christianity and other new religions displaced them. The great temples fell into ruin, their bricks carried away for other building projects, their ziggurats eroding back into shapeless mounds, and the very names of cities became confused. Later travelers unable to identify which tell was Babylon, which was Nineveh, the landscape of tells, artificial hills marking ancient settlements, stretching across the plain like burial mounds of a vanished world. And yet the influence persisted, invisible but pervasive, in the 7-day week inherited through Jewish tradition from Babylonian astronomy, in the division of the circle, in the mathematical techniques that passed through Greek and Arab scholars to medieval Europe, in the legal principles, in the literary motifs, the flood story, the tragic hero seeking immortality, the beloved descending to the underworld, in the very idea of the city, the state, the empire, patterns, first established between two rivers, the agricultural techniques, the administrative methods, the astronomical knowledge, the mathematical insights, all moved outward, influencing peoples who never knew their origin, becoming part of the common heritage of civilization, foundations so deeply buried that we forget they exist. Until archaeologists dig through layers of earth and find the tablets, brittle and brown, covered in wedge-shaped impressions, and scholars spend lifetimes learning to read them, recovering voices that speak of flood and drought, of love and loss, of the daily transactions of life, of humanity in its earliest experiments with complexity, with permanence, with the attempt to create something that would outlast individual lives, that would touch eternity. And so I return to the silence, to the mounds rising from the plain like gentle waves frozen in earth, and I think about what it means that this beginning, this first great experiment in complexity, happened here, in a place that offered no easy answers. No forests full of timber, no mountains rich with metal, no reliable rainfall, only two rivers and the silt they carried and the challenge of making life possible in between. The innovation was born of necessity, irrigation because without it nothing would grow, writing because the systems became too complex to hold in memory, law because density created friction, conflict, the need for agreed-upon rules, and cities because collective effort could achieve what individuals could not, could move the earth, redirect the water, build monuments that scrape the sky. But there was more than necessity. There was also wonder, the impulse to look at the stars and see not chaos, but pattern to ask where the world came from, why humans die, while gods do not, what makes a life worth living, and the answers they found, preserved in epic and hymn and wisdom literature, still resonate, still speak to questions we continue to ask. The Epic of Gilgamesh, that ancient poem, 2/3 God and 1/3 human, the king who has everything except the one thing he truly wants, immortality, friendship, meaning, and his journey takes him to the ends of the earth, through darkness, across deadly waters, to find the one man who survived the flood, who was granted eternal life. And the lesson he learns is not what he sought. He learns that death is inevitable, that the quest for immortality is futile, but that a well-built wall, a good name, acts of kindness and courage, these can outlast the body. There is something profoundly modern in this ancient wisdom, the acceptance of limitation, the focus on legacy rather than literal survival. And Gilgamesh returns to Uruk and shows his companion the walls he built, the city he made great, and finds in that a kind of peace, a resolution to the terror of mortality. Or consider the wisdom literature, the Akkadian dialogue between a master and his slave, where every proposed action is first endorsed, then contradicted. Should I go to the palace? Yes, master, for the king will honor you. No, master, for the king will destroy you. Should I love a woman? Yes, master, for love is sweet. No, master, for women are faithless. And on, until the slave suggests the only solution is death for both of them. And the master asks if the slave will die first, and the slave responds that no. The master cannot live even 3 days without him. A dark comedy about the impossibility of wisdom, the contradictory nature of existence, performed 4,000 years ago and still cutting, still true. The religious thought, too, shows remarkable sophistication. The gods are not omnibenevolent, not all-powerful. They have limitations, make mistakes, feel regret. They created humans to serve them, to grow food and maintain temples, to relieve the gods of labor, and this relationship is transactional, sacrifices for blessings, prayers for protection, but it can fail. The gods can be capricious, unjust, and this generates a literature of complaint. The righteous sufferer, questioning why the gods allow the innocent to suffer while the wicked prosper, the Odyssey in its earliest form. Wrestling with the problem of divine justice millennia before Job, I think about the continuity of human concerns, how the scribes of Mesopotamia worried about education, about children who would rather play than study. We have their school texts, the dialogue between teacher and student, the father scolding his son for laziness, the complaints about how hard the curriculum is, how strict the masters are, and across 4,000 years, the essential experience is unchanged, recognizable, almost funny in its familiarity, or the love poetry, the sacred marriage texts between Inanna and Dumuzi, erotic and tender, celebrating physical desire, the goddess praising her lover's beauty, his strength, their union ensuring fertility for the land, the crops, the herds, and alongside the sacred texts, profane ones, tavern songs, body humor, evidence of a full emotional and sensual life, not just the monumental cue and the official, but the intimate, the playful, the human. The mathematical achievements deserve pause. The Mesopotamians understood the Pythagorean theorem more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras. They could solve quadratic equations, calculate compound interest, determine the volume of irregular shapes, and they did this with a number system that used position notation, understanding that the same symbol could represent different values depending on where it appeared, a conceptual leap that made complex calculation possible. And their mathematical tables, their problem sets for students, show a pedagogical tradition, knowledge systematically transmitted, refined, expanded across generations, the astronomical observations accumulated over centuries, revealing patterns invisible to a single lifetime of watching. The Venus tablets of Ammisaduqa, recording the planet's appearances and disappearances over 21 years, recognizing the cycle, using it to predict, and this patient observation, this commitment to record keeping, to building knowledge incrementally, represents a profound faith in the future, in the value of knowing, even when the knowledge has no immediate practical application. And the art, the standard of Ur with its panels showing war and peace, banquet and battle, the delicate shell and lapis inlay, showing such attention to detail, such skill, or the golden bull's head from the great lyre, fierce and beautiful, decorated with scenes of animals acting as humans, a lion carrying food, a donkey playing a harp, humor and craft combined, or the portrait heads, the gypsum eyes inlaid with shell and lapis, staring across millennia with an intensity that feels almost alive, almost aware. These weren't primitive people stumbling towards civilization. They were fully human, fully conscious, as intelligent as we are, working with the materials and knowledge available to them, solving problems, creating beauty, asking questions that had no easy answers, and succeeding, creating a culture rich enough, complex enough to sustain itself for 3,000 years. 3,000 years, let that settle. The span from the first Sumerian cities to the last cuneiform tablet is longer than from the fall of Rome to now, longer than the history of any modern nation. And during that immense stretch, empires rose and fell, languages changed, populations mixed. But the fundamental patterns persisted. The ziggurat at the city center, the scribal schools preserving knowledge, the legal codes regulating behavior, the astronomical observations tracking celestial time until it ended, not in catastrophe exactly, but in slow dissolution, the center of gravity shifting west to the Mediterranean, to Greece and Rome, and the accumulated wisdom of Mesopotamia, its libraries and archives, became inaccessible, waiting in buried cities, in collapsed archives, for the archaeologists who would begin excavating in the 19th century, who would slowly, painstakingly learn to read cuneiform again, to piece together the shattered tablets, to reconstruct the voices of the dead, and now those voices speak again in museums and libraries, in scholarly editions and translations, the oldest literature, the oldest laws, the oldest cities, all emerging from the earth between two rivers, from the land that is now Iraq, still troubled, still marked by conflict, but holding in its soil the evidence of humanity's first great civilizations, the foundation upon which so much was built. I stand again at the edge of the idea, but now it has dimension, depth, faces and voices, not just abstractions, but individual scribes signing their names to tablets, kings boasting of conquests, lovers exchanging glances in poems, teachers scolding students, astronomers tracking Venus, mathematicians solving equations, all of them dead so long their bones are dust, but their words remain pressed into clay, waiting to be read, to connect us to them, to remind us that we are part of something larger, older than we usually remember. The rivers still flow, the Tigris and Euphrates, though dams have changed their course. Pollution has dimmed their waters, but they flow, and the land between them still holds secrets, tells that have not been excavated, tablets that have not been read, whole cities perhaps still buried, waiting, and the influence ripples outward, invisible but real, in every city we build, every law we write, every story we tell, every calculation we make, every star we name. We are the inheritors of Mesopotamia, whether we know it or not, carrying forward patterns first established when the world was young, when writing was new, when the very idea of civilization was still being invented, still being tested, still being passed from one generation to the next, like a flame in darkness, fragile but enduring, bright enough to read by, warm enough to gather around, essential to everything that came after. The night deepens and the stars turn overhead, the same stars the Babylonian astronomers watched, the same patterns, eternal and indifferent, and beneath them the earth holds its memories, silent, patient, waiting for anyone curious enough to dig, to listen, to hear what the ancient voices have to say about being human, about building, about trying to make something permanent in a world of flood and drought, of conquest and collapse, of death that comes for everyone, king and scribe and slave alike, but also about the things that survive. The words pressed into clay, the ideas passed from mind to mind, the long conversation across time, which continues, which includes us now, as we too speak into the future, hoping someone will listen, will remember, will carry forward what we learned, what we built, what we dreamed in our brief time between the rivers of birth and death. There is something almost otherworldly about the glow of a screen in a darkened room, the way light spills across faces turned upward in concentration, the quiet hum of electricity flowing through circuits and chips, carrying with it entire universes of possibility. I find myself thinking tonight about how we learn to play in new ways, how humanity discovered it could build worlds inside machines, worlds made entirely of light and logic and imagination, worlds that existed nowhere except in the dance of electrons through silicon pathways, and yet felt as real as anything we could touch. The story begins in places you might not expect, in research laboratories where massive computers filled entire rooms, their tape reels spinning slowly, their vacuum tubes glowing amber in the dimness, scientists and engineers working late into the evening, not on weapons or calculations or data processing, but on something stranger, something that seemed almost frivolous at the time. They were teaching machines to play. In those early days, before anyone imagined what would come, the very idea seemed peculiar. Computers were serious instruments, built for serious purposes, costing hundreds of thousands of dollars, occupying specially cooled rooms in university basements and military installations, and yet there were those who wondered quietly what else these thinking machines might do. The impulse to play is older than our species, older than civilization itself. We see it in every young animal, the way kittens stalk and pounce, the way wolf cubs wrestle and chase, Play is how we learn the rules of our world, how we practice for challenges we cannot yet imagine. And when we built machines that could think, even in the most primitive ways, we almost immediately began to wonder if they too could play. The earliest experiments were simple, almost absurdly so by modern standards, a game of tic-tac-toe rendered in glowing lines on an oscilloscope screen, a simulation of tennis played with paddles that were nothing more than vertical bars of light, a maze navigated by a blinking dot. These were not yet worlds. They were sketches, whispers of possibility, fingers testing the edges of a door that had not yet opened. But there was something magnetic in that simplicity, something that drew people closer to those enormous machines. Scientists would pause in their work to watch. Students would gather. Even people who knew nothing about programming or electronics found themselves captivated by the sight of light responding to intention, a paddle moving because a dial was turned, a dot changing direction because a button was pressed, cause and effect rendered in phosphorescent green or amber glow. The technology was primitive, laughably so, but the feeling it created was not. There was wonder in it, the same wonder that comes from any act of creation, from making something that did not exist before. And more than that, there was interaction, conversation, the machine responding to human input, not just calculating an answer, but creating an experience, a loop of action and reaction that felt almost alive. No one was calling it an industry yet. No one imagined billion-dollar corporations or global competitions or millions of players connected across continents. These were experiments, curiosities, technical demonstrations, ways to show what computers might someday be capable of. And yet, in those flickering displays and simple sounds, in the quiet rooms where researchers leaned close to screens, something fundamental was being born. The idea that we could enter other spaces, not physically, but mentally, that we could extend ourselves into realms that existed only as patterns of electrical charge, that we could compete and explore and solve puzzles in dimensions made of pure mathematics. This was new, genuinely new, a form of play that had never existed before in all of human history. And it arrived quietly, without fanfare, in university labs and research centers, in the minds of people who were supposed to be working on serious things, but who couldn't resist the urge to see what happened when you added a second paddle, or made the ball move faster, or created a simple maze with walls that had to be navigated. Each small addition was a discovery, a step further into territory no one had mapped. The machines themselves were monuments of their era, steel cabinets and blinking lights, paper tape and magnetic drums, toggle switches in neat rows, nothing portable, nothing personal. These were institutional devices, shared resources, and yet, even then, even in that age of massive mainframes and batch processing, people were beginning to glimpse something else, a future where these experiences might become smaller, more accessible, more intimate. The first person to see the true potential, to understand that this could be more than demonstration, more than curiosity, was perhaps a man named William Higginbotham, working at Brookhaven National Laboratory in the late 1950s, where he had been tasked with something that seemed simple enough: make the annual Visitors' Day more interesting, show the public what scientists actually did in these mysterious government facilities. He created something he called Tennis for Two, and it appeared on an oscilloscope screen, a small circular display perhaps 5 inches across, showing a side view of a tennis court rendered as a single line, a net in the middle represented by a short vertical dash, and a ball that arced according to actual physics, gravity pulling it down, momentum carrying it forward. Players turned knobs to adjust the angle of their shots and pressed buttons to send the ball flying across that glowing green line. It existed for 2 days, maybe 3, during those autumn open houses in 1958 and 1959, and then it was dismantled. The equipment returned to its original purposes. Higginbotham never patented it, never imagined it might be worth something. It was just a demonstration, a way to show that computers could calculate trajectories in real time, could simulate physical laws, could respond instantly to human input. But the people who played it, they stood in line. They waited their turn. They played again and again. Something about that simple interaction, the satisfaction of timing a shot correctly, the challenge of outmaneuvering an opponent, the pure pleasure of cause and effect rendered in light, it captured something fundamental about what play could become in this new medium. Around the same time, in different laboratories, other minds were exploring similar territory. At MIT, a place that would become legendary for its contributions to interactive computing, students were gathering around a machine called the PDP-1, a computer that was revolutionary not for its power but for its accessibility. It had a screen, a cathode ray tube display, and it could respond quickly enough to create the illusion of real-time interaction. A young programmer named Steve Russell, working late nights as students did, as they still do, began to imagine something more elaborate than tennis or tic-tac-toe. He imagined spaceships, dogfighting in the void, influenced by the science fiction he loved, the stories of A.E. Doc Smith with their lens-wielding heroes and spectacular space battles. He began to code. The result was Space War, and it took him months to create, months of typing instructions on paper tape, debugging, refining. Other students contributed. One added a star field in the background. Another programmed a gravity well, a sun in the center of the screen that pulled the ships toward it, creating danger, adding strategy, forcing players to use gravity itself as a weapon or a hazard to avoid. By 1962, it was finished, or as finished as these things ever were, because it kept evolving, kept growing. Other programmers added features, improved the physics, refined the controls. It spread from machine to machine. Anywhere there was a PDP-1, someone would eventually install Space War, and people would gather to play. It was beautiful in its way. Those white lines against black, 2 ships rendered as simple triangles, torpedoes as bright dots streaking across the void, the star in the center pulling everything toward destruction. Players had to think in curves, in orbital mechanics, had to time their shots while managing their limited fuel and weapons. It was pure skill, pure challenge, and it was mesmerizing. The fact that it ran on a computer worth over $100,000, the equivalent of millions today, made it absurd, impractical, a waste of expensive processing time, and yet it persisted. It survived because the people who had access to these machines, the researchers and students and engineers, they couldn't resist. They would play during lunch breaks, late at night, whenever the machine wasn't needed for serious work. They held tournaments, developed strategies, became experts at navigating those simple vectors. This was the pattern that would repeat again and again. The technology created for other purposes, for calculation or simulation or data processing, but immediately colonized by the human desire to play, to compete, to master systems and explore possibilities. The impulse was too strong to suppress, too fundamental to ignore. Through the 1960s, these experiments multiplied, remained scattered, confined to universities and research institutions. There was no way for ordinary people to access them, no commercial market, no distribution system. They existed in isolated pockets, passed from programmer to programmer like folklore, like songs taught by ear. But something was changing in the wider world of computing. The machines were getting smaller, not small, but smaller. About transistors replaced vacuum tubes. Integrated circuits began to replace individual transistors, and the cost, slowly, painfully slowly, began to drop, and the accessibility began to rise. A handful of visionaries began to imagine something radical. Computers that individuals could own, that could sit on desks instead of filling rooms, that could be interactive instead of batch processed, that could respond immediately to human input. This seemed like fantasy to most. Computers were institutional tools, serious instruments. But the dreamers persisted. In the late 1960s, a man named Ralph Baer, working at a defense contractor, began to think about television sets, about the fact that in America they sat in living rooms, glowing several hours each evening, displaying images broadcast from distant stations, and he wondered, what if they could display other things? What if they could become interactive? What if you could play games on them? His supervisors were skeptical. This wasn't what the company did. Wasn't related to defense contracts or military applications. But Baer was persistent. He built prototypes in secret at first, then with grudging permission, creating circuits that could generate simple shapes on a screen, that could move those shapes in response to player input, that could detect collisions, could keep score. By 1968, he had a working demonstration about a brown box, it was called, because of its wood grain exterior, and it could play several different games, chase games, tennis games, shooting games where players aimed light guns at targets on the screen. It was crude, simple, but it worked. And more importantly, it was fun, genuinely entertaining in a way that felt different from anything else. Bayer shopped it to television manufacturers. Most weren't interested. They made televisions, not toys, not game machines, but eventually Magnavox saw potential. They licensed the technology, refined it, prepared it for commercial release. And in 1972, they introduced the Magnavox Odyssey, the first home video game console, the first device designed specifically to let people play electronic games in their living rooms. It was expensive, $100, equivalent to several hundred today, and it required attachments, plastic overlays that stuck to the television screen to provide color and graphics that the system itself couldn't generate. The games were simple, extraordinarily simple, dots and lines moving on a black background, but it sold, not spectacularly, but it sold, proving that there was an appetite, a market for this new form of entertainment. That same year, 1972, a different revolution was beginning in a different place. Nolan Bushnell, a young engineer who had played Space War at university, who understood its appeal, who saw its potential, founded a company called Atari, a name borrowed from the Japanese game Go, meaning a state where a stone or group of stones is about to be captured. His first product was a simple game, inspired by the tennis games that had come before, but refined, perfected, reduced to absolute purity. 2 paddles, 1 ball, a dotted line down the middle representing a net, and the simple instruction on the cabinet, avoid missing ball for high score. He called it Pong, and it changed everything. The first prototype was installed in a bar in Sunnyvale, California, a small tavern called Andy Caps, and within days the machine stopped working, not because it was broken, but because the coin box was so full of quarters that it jammed the mechanism. People were lining up to play, feeding coins into the machine over and over. The simplicity was the appeal. Anyone could understand it immediately, but mastering it, developing the reflexes and timing and strategy, that took practice. Bushnell realized he had discovered something, not just a game, but a business model, arcade machines, coin-operated entertainment, placed in public spaces, bars and pizza parlors and bowling alleys, and eventually dedicated arcades, places where people would come specifically to play, feeding quarter after quarter into machines, chasing high scores, competing with strangers. The arcade era was beginning, though no one called it that yet. Atari began manufacturing Pong machines as fast as they could, and they still couldn't keep up with demand. Other companies saw the success and rushed to create their own versions, their own games. The technology was simple enough that small manufacturers could enter the market, and suddenly there was an industry, raw and chaotic and exploding with energy. These early arcade games had a quality that's hard to explain to those who never experienced them. They were physical objects, wooden cabinets with artwork, with coin slots and start buttons, with joysticks that had weight and resistance, with screens that glowed in darkened rooms. They made sounds, beeps and boops synthesized from simple circuits that echoed in the spaces where they lived. And they were social, communal. You played them in public or with witnesses, with an audience of people waiting their turn or simply watching. The golden age of the arcade arrived quietly at first, then all at once, through the late 1970s and into the early 1980s. When walking into a darkened arcade meant entering a space of pure sensation, the cacophony of dozens of machines competing for attention, each one calling out with its own distinctive sounds, the electronic warbles of space invaders, the waka, waka, waka of Pac-Man, the missile explosions of Missile Command, all blending into a symphony of synthetic noise. The carpet was always dark, patterned to hide stains, and the lighting was dim, partly to save money, partly to make the screens more visible, but also because it created an atmosphere, a sense of stepping out of the ordinary world into somewhere else, somewhere that operated by different rules, where your worth was measured in high scores and extra lives, where quarters were the currency of dreams. Space Invaders arrived in 1978 from Japan, created by a designer named Tomohiro Nishikado, and it introduced something that would become fundamental to the medium, a sense of overwhelming odds, of inevitable defeat. The aliens marched down the screen in formation, left, right, and with each row you destroyed, the remaining ones moved faster, the tension building, the music accelerating, that four-note bass line becoming more frantic as the invaders descended. Players hid behind barriers that slowly eroded under enemy fire, learning to peek out and shoot, to time their movements, to aim for the flying saucer that crossed the top of the screen for bonus points. And when the last invader was destroyed, the next wave began. Harder, faster. There was no winning, only surviving as long as skill and reflexes allowed, and then entering your initials on the high score table, 3 letters to represent your achievement, your proof that you had been there, had played, had excelled. The game caused a shortage of 100 yen coins in Japan, or so the legend goes, whether literally true or not. It captured something real about the game's impact, its addictive quality, the way people would play again and again, chasing the feeling of that perfect run, that moment when reflexes and strategy aligned and the invaders fell in satisfying cascades. Asteroids came in 1979 with vector graphics instead of raster, meaning the images were drawn with bright lines instead of pixels, giving everything a crisp, geometric beauty. You piloted a small triangular ship through a field of tumbling asteroids, shooting them into smaller and smaller fragments, each shot splitting them, creating more hazards even as you cleared the screen. And when all the asteroids were gone, more appeared, larger, faster. The physics felt real, or real enough. Momentum carried you forward. Rotation happened smoothly. You could thrust and coast, could use gravity or its absence. The game rewarded spatial thinking, the ability to predict trajectories, to position yourself for the next shot while avoiding the current threats. And it introduced a panic button, hyperspace, that would teleport you to a random location, possibly to safety, possibly into instant death, a desperate gamble when all other options were exhausted. But it was Pac-Man, arriving in 1980, that transcended the medium. That became something more than a game, became a cultural phenomenon, appeared on lunchboxes and Saturday morning cartoons, inspired a top 40 song, Pac-Man Fever, that actually charted, became something your parents and grandparents recognized, even if they'd never played. Toru Iwatani designed it to appeal beyond the young men who dominated arcades, created something nonviolent, colorful, approachable, a yellow circle that ate dots in a maze, pursued by 4 ghosts, each with its own behavior pattern, its own personality. Blinky was aggressive, always chasing. Pinky tried to position herself ahead of you. Inky was unpredictable. Clyde seemed almost random. Learning these patterns, understanding how to manipulate them, was the key to mastery. The game had rhythm. Moving through the maze became almost musical, the waka waka sound of Pac-Man eating dots, creating a steady beat. And then the moment of reversal when you ate a power pellet, and the ghosts turned blue and fled, and you chased them, the hunter becoming the hunted for just a few precious seconds before the cycle began again. Arcades multiplied, appeared in shopping malls and bowling alleys, in dedicated spaces that smelled of carpet cleaner and cigarette smoke, where teenagers gathered after school, where some players became legendary, known for their ability to play a single quarter for hours, to rack up scores that seemed impossible, to perform techniques that others would gather around to watch, to witness. The machines themselves were works of art, each cabinet decorated with elaborate painted artwork, airbrushed scenes of space battles or fantasy landscapes, of the characters and scenarios from the game. The art was often more detailed than anything the game itself could display, creating a promise, an aspiration, showing what your imagination should add to those simple pixels and sounds. Donkey Kong appeared in 1981, Nintendo's first major success in America, and it introduced something new, a narrative, however simple, a story told through the gameplay itself. A carpenter named Jumpman, later renamed Mario, trying to rescue his girlfriend from a giant ape who had climbed a construction site. The game had multiple screens of different challenges, ladders to climb and barrels to jump, and when you rescued the girl, the ape climbed higher, started the cycle again, harder, faster. The designer, Shigeru Miyamoto, understood something about character and personality, even with the limited graphics available. Just a few pixels, he created figures that felt alive, that had weight and momentum, that jumped and ran in ways that felt satisfying, responsive. The controls were tight, precise. When you died, it felt like your fault, not the game cheating, and that made you want to try again, to do better, to prove you could master it. Dragon's Lair arrived in 1983 like a vision from the future, using Laserdisc technology to display actual animation, hand-drawn by former Disney animator Don Bluth. It looked like nothing else in the arcade. Full-screen cartoon graphics, smooth movement, cinematic scenes. Players gasped when they first saw it, crowded around the cabinet to watch. Even if they weren't playing, but it was essentially an elaborate timing game, a series of quick-time events. You watched the animation and pressed the joystick in the right direction at the right moment, or pressed the sword button to attack. Success meant seeing the next scene. Failure meant an elaborate death animation, and there were many ways to die. The game was punishingly difficult, each play rarely lasting more than a minute. Quarters vanished quickly, but that animation, those fluid movements, that cinematic quality, it showed where the technology might go, even if the gameplay itself was limited. Meanwhile, in homes, a different revolution was unfolding. The Atari 2600 had launched in 1977, a home console that used interchangeable cartridges, meaning you could buy new games, build a library, weren't limited to whatever was built into the machine. It was brilliant, revolutionary, and it sold millions. The games were simpler than their arcade counterparts. The 2600 was not powerful. Its graphics were blocky, abstract, but it brought the experience home, let you play as much as you wanted without feeding quarters, let you practice, improve, master games in private before facing them in public, and for children for whom arcade visits were limited by parental permission and available money. It was a gateway to unlimited play. Activision formed in 1979, the first third-party game developer, founded by former Atari programmers who wanted credit for their work, wanted their names on the games they created. Atari had treated programmers as anonymous, interchangeable, but these developers knew their work had value, had artistry. They began making games for Atari's console without Atari's permission, and when Atari sued, Activision won, establishing the right of independent developers to create software for existing platforms. This opened floodgates. Suddenly, dozens of companies were making games for the 2600. The quality varied wildly. Some were excellent. Pitfall, with its jungle exploration and precise jumping, River Raid with its scrolling terrain and fuel management, Others were rushed, poorly conceived, cynical cash grabs, trading on popular movies or concepts, and the market began to flood, to saturate. Too many games, too many bad games, confusion setting in. The home computer revolution was arriving simultaneously. The Apple II, the Commodore 64, the Atari 400 and 800, machines that could play games but could also program, could word process, could theoretically justify their cost as educational, as useful. Parents who would never buy a game console might buy a computer, and game developers eagerly created software for these platforms. These computer games could be more complex, had more memory, more storage via floppy disks. They could save progress, could have deeper mechanics, longer experiences. Games like Ultima and Wizardry created vast fantasy worlds to explore, with statistics and inventory and quests, experiences that unfolded over dozens of hours, that required mapping on graph paper, taking notes, investing real time and thought. Zork and its sequels brought text adventures to prominence, games with no graphics at all, just descriptions. You are in a maze of twisty little passages all alike, and you typed commands. Go north, take lamp, examine mailbox. The parser was limited, often frustrating, but when it worked, when the game understood your intent, when you solved a puzzle through logic and experimentation, the satisfaction was profound. You were using language itself as the interface, your imagination creating all the visuals. The crash came in 1983, sudden and catastrophic. The North American video game market collapsed under its own weight. Too many consoles, too many bad games, too many disappointed customers who bought expensive cartridges based on movie licenses or popular brands, only to find broken, unplayable, joyless experiences. Retailers returned up millions of unsold units. Companies went bankrupt overnight. The industry seemed finished, a fad that had burned bright and died. E.T., the extraterrestrial, became the symbol of the crash. A game rushed to market in just 5 weeks to capitalize on the movie, programmed by a single developer working impossible hours, released for the Christmas season of 1982, and it was nearly unplayable, confusing, frustrating. Millions of copies were manufactured based on the movie's popularity, and most went unsold, eventually buried in a landfill in New Mexico, a literal burial of the industry's excess and hubris. But while America mourned, while retailers cleared their shelves of gaming products, while industry experts declared the video game a dead medium, something else was happening across the Pacific. In Japan, Nintendo was preparing something different, something that would change everything again. The Famicom launched in Japan in 1983, the family computer, designed to be affordable, reliable, and coupled with games of genuine quality. Shigeru Miyamoto's understanding of game design, of what made play satisfying, was embedded in the system's flagship titles, and when it came to America 2 years later, rebranded as the Nintendo Entertainment System, it was positioned carefully, not as a game console. Retailers wouldn't stock game consoles, but as an entertainment system, a toy, something different. It came with a robot, ROB, the robotic operating buddy, and a light gun, the Zapper, accessories that made it seem novel, innovative, not just another game machine. And the initial games were carefully chosen, limited in number, high in quality. Super Mario Bros. Launched with the system, and it was a revelation. Mario ran from left to right across scrolling levels, the screen moving smoothly, revealing new challenges, new secrets, hidden blocks that contained coins or power-ups, warp pipes that led to underground bonus rooms. The first time you found a hidden passage, discovered a secret area. The game rewarded exploration, curiosity. It wasn't just about reaching the end, it was about discovering everything along the way. The controls felt perfect. Mario accelerated when you held the button, jumped higher if you held it longer, had momentum and weight. Running and jumping became a rhythm, a dance. The game taught through design rather than instruction, the first level introducing each concept naturally, letting you learn by doing. And when you died, and you would die often, you started the level again, immediate, no waiting, just try again, do better. Nintendo understood curation, controlled their platform carefully, required developers to meet quality standards, limited how many games each company could release per year. Their seal of approval on each cartridge became a promise, a guarantee of basic functionality, of actual game design. This wasn't the Wild West of the Atari era. This was a carefully managed ecosystem. The Legend of Zelda arrived in 1986, and it expanded what console games could be, a vast overworld to explore. Dungeons hidden across the landscape, no linear path, no single way forward. You could go almost anywhere from the start. Some areas too dangerous, some secrets too obscure, but the freedom was intoxicating. The sense of being an adventurer in an actual world, not just moving through predetermined levels. It came with a gold cartridge, special, different from the standard gray, and it had a battery inside, allowing you to save your progress, to turn off the system and return later to the same point in your journey. This seems trivial now, expected, but then it was transformative. Games could be longer, more complex, could respect your time, your investment. Metroid followed, with its atmosphere of isolation and mystery, exploring alien caverns, no friendly characters, no safe havens, just you and the hostile environment, and the revelation at the end, if you finished quickly enough, that the armored bounty hunter you'd been playing was a woman. Samus Aran, in an era when game protagonists were almost universally male. This was quiet revolution, representation without announcement. The late 1980s saw an explosion of creativity, developers understanding the medium better, pushing against its limitations. Final Fantasy told elaborate stories with turn-based combat. Mega Man offered non-linear level selection and abilities stolen from defeated bosses. Castlevania created gothic atmosphere with just a few colors and simple sprites, each game finding its own identity, its own way of using the constraints creatively. Sega entered the market with the Genesis, positioned as the cooler alternative. Genesis does what Nintendo don't. The ads proclaimed, targeting older players, teenagers who wanted something edgier, faster. Sonic the Hedgehog became their mascot, designed specifically to show off the Genesis's processing speed, levels that scrolled at velocity, loops and curves and springs launching you through elaborate landscapes, the antithesis of Mario's careful platforming, all momentum and attitude. The bit wars began, 16 bits versus 8, each new system promising more colors, more sounds, more detail. The Super Nintendo arrived with Mode 7 graphics that could rotate and scale the playing field, creating pseudo three-dimensional effects, F-Zero racing through futuristic tracks that seemed to have real depth, real perspective, Star Fox rendering actual polygons, true 3 dimensions, simple and angular, but undeniably the future. Japan was producing role-playing games of increasing sophistication, Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy and Phantasy Star, creating epic narratives, parties of characters developing over dozens of hours, worlds to explore, stories with actual emotional weight, Chrono Trigger with its time travel and multiple endings, Final Fantasy VI with its ensemble, cast, and apocalyptic stakes. These weren't just games anymore. They were journeys, commitments, experiences that stayed with you. The arcade was changing, evolving. Fighting games became the new center of competitive play. Street Fighter II arrived in 1991 and created a phenomenon. 6 buttons and a joystick controlling elaborate martial artists, each with unique moves, special attacks performed with specific controller motions, quarter circle forward and punch for a fireball, Dragon Punch requiring precise timing. The skill ceiling was enormous. Professional players could perform combos that seemed superhuman, linking attacks in ways that required frame-perfect timing. Arcades became gathering places for serious competition, players challenging each other, money on the table, reputations built and destroyed, the social element reaching new heights. You could learn by watching, by studying the techniques of better players, by asking questions, by joining a community that existed in physical space, in specific locations, arcades in specific neighborhoods becoming known for their talent, their scene. Mortal Kombat pushed violence to new extremes, digitized actors instead of sprites, performing moves that ended with elaborate fatalities, ways to finish your opponent with exaggerated gore. It was controversial, led to Senate hearings, to the creation of the ESRB rating system, but it also showed the medium maturing, dealing with adult themes, even if sometimes crudely, even if sometimes just for shock value. Home computers were becoming more powerful. CD-ROM drives allowing for full motion video, for orchestral soundtracks, for voice acting. Myst arrived in 1993 with its pre-rendered graphics, its point-and-click exploration of a mysterious island, its puzzles that required actual note-taking, actual thought. It sold millions, became the best-selling PC game of its era, proved that games could be contemplative, slow-paced, beautiful in a painterly way. Doom launched the same year, and it was the opposite of contemplative, first-person movement through 3-dimensional corridors, shooting demons from hell with an escalating arsenal, fast, violent, visceral, and it included multiplayer, letting you connect computers over networks, over phone lines, and compete or cooperate. This was revolutionary, the beginning of online play as a standard feature, as an expectation. The technology was accelerating, graphics improving rapidly. PlayStation arrived in 1994, dedicated to 3-dimensional gaming, discs instead of cartridges, allowing for larger games, more content. Final Fantasy VII in 1997, with its pre-rendered backgrounds and polygon characters, its story spanning 3 discs, its cinematics that seemed almost like film, the line between game and other media blurring. Nintendo responded with the Nintendo 64, truly 3-dimensional worlds, Mario exploring castle grounds and painting worlds, Zelda finally in 3 dimensions, with Ocarina of Time, C-button camera control and Z-targeting, systems that would become standard, but at the time felt innovative, solutions to problems that 3-dimensional gaming created. How do you orient yourself? How do you keep track of enemies? How do you make combat work when you can move in any direction? The strange thing about technological evolution, about the way these digital worlds grew more complex and detailed, is how the fundamental appeal never changed. Whether you were moving a paddle to intercept a square pixel or piloting a photorealistic spacecraft through a rendered galaxy, the core experience remained the same. The challenge, the mastery, the satisfaction of improving, of understanding systems and exploiting them, of imposing your will on a small pocket of reality that followed consistent rules. There's something deeply human in this, the desire to enter spaces where cause and effect are predictable, where practice leads to improvement, where the chaos of existence is replaced temporarily with logic and pattern in the real world. Effort doesn't always correlate with reward. Skill doesn't guarantee success. But in these created spaces, these rule-bound universes, there was fairness, difficulty, but fairness. The evolution continued, relentless, massively multiplayer games creating persistent worlds where thousands played simultaneously. World of Warcraft launching in 2004 and becoming a cultural touchstone, a place where people met, formed friendships, fell in love, spent thousands of hours not because they were addicted, though some were, but because they found community, purpose, identity. Raids requiring coordination between 40 players, each performing specific roles, succeeding or failing as a group. Motion controls arrived with the Wii. Suddenly, your grandmother was playing virtual bowling. Your parents were trying virtual tennis. The barrier of complex controllers removed, replaced with intuitive gestures. Swing the remote like a racket, like a golf club, like a sword. Millions who had never considered gaming found themselves playing, found it accessible, fun, the industry expanding beyond its traditional audience, beyond young men in darkened rooms. Mobile gaming exploded with smartphones. Suddenly everyone had a gaming device in their pocket. Casual games, puzzle games, Angry Birds and Candy Crush reaching hundreds of millions of players. People who would never buy a console, never consider themselves gamers, playing on buses, in waiting rooms, in stolen moments. The definition of what gaming could be expanding, fragmenting, becoming everything and anything. Independent developers found new platforms. Digital distribution, meaning you didn't need a publisher, didn't need to convince a corporation to manufacture cartridges. You could create something in your bedroom, release it to the world. Minecraft starting as one person's project, spreading through word of mouth, becoming one of the best-selling games ever made. Its blocky aesthetic, its creative freedom, its lack of explicit goals, letting players define their own purposes, build their own stories. Virtual reality arrived, stumbled, arrived again, each iteration more convincing, more immersive, the promise of actually being inside the game world. Not watching a screen, but wearing the environment, looking around by moving your head, reaching out and interacting with your hands. The technology is still imperfect, still limited, but improving, showing glimpses of what might come, of presence, of embodiment in digital space. Esports grew from arcade competitions to stadium events, professional players earning millions, tournaments broadcast to audiences of millions more, the stigma of gaming as childish or wasteful slowly eroding, recognition that the skills required, the reflexes and strategy and teamwork were legitimate, valuable, worth celebrating, worth compensating. The stories games told became more sophisticated, more ambitious. The Last of Us exploring love and loss and moral ambiguity. Red Dead Redemption 2 creating a world of overwhelming detail and melancholy beauty. Thousands of individual animations, weather systems and ecosystems, characters with routines and relationships, the line between authored narrative and emergent experience blurring, becoming irrelevant. And yet, through all of this evolution, through all these technological leaps and market expansions, something remained constant. The same thing that made people line up to play tennis for two on that tiny oscilloscope screen, the same thing that kept MIT students playing Space War when they should have been studying the fundamental pleasure of interaction, of agency, of making choices and seeing consequences, of getting better at something that seemed impossible at first. The medium had grown from curiosity to industry, from niche interest to cultural mainstream, from simple diversions to complex art, but at its heart, at the very core of what made it compelling, was the basic human desire to play, to explore, to master, to exist for a while in spaces where the rules made sense, where improvement was possible, where you could try again, could always try again. These worlds made of light and mathematics, of pixels and polygons, of carefully crafted systems and emergent behaviors. They had become part of human culture, part of how we tell stories, part of how we connect, part of how we play, and the strange thing, the remarkable thing, is that it all started with scientists and engineers wondering what their massive calculating machines might do besides calculate, whether these thinking devices might also dream, might also play, in the quiet of a darkened arcade, now rare, nostalgic spaces. You can still hear echoes of that first wonder, the electronic sounds of Space Invaders and Pac-Man mixing with modern titles, the clack of joysticks and the press of buttons, the satisfying tactile feedback of physical controls, and if you stand there long enough, watching light dance across screens, watching players lean forward in concentration, you can feel the through line, the connection between then and now, between the simplest games and the most complex, between individual moments and the vast sweep of this strange new medium. The glow of screens has become part of our landscape. Consoles beneath televisions, computers on desks, phones in pockets, handheld devices on trains and planes. The ability to enter other worlds to play is always available now, always accessible. What once required finding specific machines in specific places, feeding them quarters, hoping no one else was playing, is now ubiquitous, expected, ordinary in a way that would have seemed miraculous to those early pioneers. And perhaps that's the real transformation, not the graphics or the processing power or the online connectivity, though all of those matter, but the shift from extraordinary to ordinary, from special occasion to everyday occurrence, from expensive novelty to expected feature of modern life. Gaming stopped being something you did and became something that simply was, a medium among media, an art form among art forms, a way of experiencing stories and challenges and beauty and connection. The history is still being written, still unfolding, virtual worlds growing larger, more persistent, more convincing, artificial intelligence creating opponents and allies that feel almost alive, almost real, technology pushing toward experiences we can't quite imagine yet, but that we know are coming, the same way those early programmers knew, somehow, that they were building something important, even when they were just making simple games, just experimenting, just playing. There's poetry in that progression, in the arc, from oscilloscope tennis to virtual reality, from one blip and one line to entire universes rendered in real time, from solitary tinkering to global industry, from hobby to art form, all because people couldn't resist the urge to make machines play, to see what happened when you gave silicon the ability to respond, to create feedback loops between human intention and digital reaction. And so the screens still glow in living rooms and bedrooms, in arcades and museums, in pockets and on wrists, carrying forward that original impulse, that first spark of curiosity about what computing might become if we let it play, if we taught it to dream alongside us, if we used it not just to calculate and process, but to create spaces where we could be different, be better, be anything, even if just for a little while, even if just in worlds made of light, fading now softly into the gentle darkness, where all stories eventually rest, where the glow becomes memory, becomes dream, becomes the quiet satisfaction of games well played and stories well told in the gathering stillness of a long and winding night. I imagine a place where silence lives, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of deep attention, the kind that gathers when countless minds have passed through the same threshold, seeking something they cannot always name. There is a particular quality to the air in certain rooms, a stillness that feels almost intentional, as though the space itself has learned to hold its breath. And in that holding, in that patient suspension, something extraordinary occurs. Knowledge becomes tangible. Ideas take on weight and texture, and time moves differently than it does in the world outside. I think of buildings constructed for a singular purpose, structures designed not for commerce or industry or spectacle, but for the patient accumulation of human understanding, places where the architecture itself whispers of continuity, where stone and wood and careful craftsmanship create chambers meant to outlast the lives of those who built them, meant to serve generations not yet born. The concept is ancient, older than empires, older than the written systems that would eventually fill these spaces. The simple recognition that what we learn, what we discover, what we create with our minds deserves to be gathered, protected, offered to those who come after. Before there were buildings, there were keepers, individuals entrusted with the responsibility of remembering, of preserving the stories and formulas and observations that form the foundation of understanding. These were living libraries, human vessels of accumulated wisdom, and the communities that relied upon them understood implicitly the fragility of knowledge passed only through voice and memory. But something shifts when knowledge finds a more permanent home, When it moves from the ephemeral territory of human recall into physical form, clay tablets pressed with wedge-shaped marks, papyrus scrolls wrapped carefully against the deterioration of time, parchment pages bound between protective covers, suddenly the scope of what can be preserved expands exponentially, and with that expansion comes the need for spaces designed specifically to house these growing collections. I picture the earliest of these places, rooms in palaces and temples where scrolls were stored in neat rows, where scholars could consult records of harvests and astronomical observations, tax collections, and royal decrees. These were not public spaces, not open to wandering curiosity, but restricted archives serving the administrative and religious functions of early civilizations. Yet even in their exclusivity, they represented something remarkable, the understanding that written knowledge required dedicated space, plus careful organization, intentional preservation. The Mesopotamians kept such collections, meticulously cataloged tablets recording everything from mathematical calculations to epic poetry. The Egyptians maintained houses of papyrus, extensive holdings of religious texts and practical manuals, and in doing so, they established patterns that would echo through millennia. The recognition that knowledge scattered and disorganized becomes knowledge lost, that collection requires curation, that preservation demands more than simply accumulating material. It requires systems, attention, devotion to the task of making information accessible. And there is something profoundly human in this impulse, this drive to gather what we have learned and make it available to others, to create institutional memory that transcends individual lifetimes. It speaks to an optimism about the future, a belief that there will be people who want to know, who need to know, who will benefit from access to the accumulated understanding of those who came before. I think about the first person to organize a collection, to decide that scrolls should be arranged by subject or author, to create some system by which a specific text could be located among hundreds or thousands. The care required for such work, the recognition that a collection without order becomes a labyrinth, beautiful perhaps in its abundance, but frustrating in its impenetrability. The ancient world saw these institutions grow in ambition and scale, moving beyond purely administrative functions towards something more expansive, the recognition that knowledge itself, divorced from immediate practical application, held value, that poetry and philosophy and history deserve preservation alongside accounting records and legal codes, that human culture produced wisdom worth maintaining even when it served no obvious utilitarian purpose, and so the buildings grew larger, the collections more diverse, the missions more encompassing. Rooms became wings, wings became entire complexes, and the people who tended these spaces, who cataloged and preserved and made accessible the gathered materials, became a distinct profession, guardians of something both precious and peculiar, repositories of human thought made manifest in physical form. The ancient Mediterranean world understood something profound about the relationship between power and knowledge, that empires built on military might alone would crumble, but empires that cultivated learning, that gathered the intellectual wealth of conquered peoples and made it their own, these could achieve a different kind of permanence, a legacy that outlasted stone monuments and territorial boundaries. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, in a city named for its conqueror, at the delta, where the Nile meets the sea, the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt conceived of something unprecedented in scale and ambition, an institution that would attempt to gather all the knowledge of the known world under a single roof, to create a collection so comprehensive that scholars justiz would need to travel nowhere else. Everything worth knowing would be there, waiting. Alexandria was already a marvel. A planned city of wide streets and impressive architecture, a meeting place of cultures where Greek and Egyptian and Jewish communities mingled, where trade routes converged and ideas cross-pollinated, and into this cosmopolitan environment came the vision of the Museion, the Temple of the Muses, and its extraordinary library. The ambition was breathtaking. Messengers were sent to every corner of the known world with instructions to purchase or copy any texts they encountered. Ships arriving at Alexandria's harbor were searched, not for contraband in the traditional sense, but for books. Any scrolls found would be confiscated, taken to the library where they would be meticulously copied. The copies returned to the ship owners, while the originals remained in the collection, a practice that spoke both to the value placed on authentic texts and to the ruthless determination to acquire knowledge by any means necessary. The numbers are staggering even by modern standards. Estimates suggest the library may have held between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls at its height. Though precise accounting is impossible now, lost to the same forces that would eventually claim the library itself. But imagine the physical reality of such a collection. Hall after hall, lined with wooden shelves or cylindrical containers, each holding rolled papyrus marked with titles and authors, a labyrinth of human thought and observation, poetry and mathematics, astronomy and medicine, history and philosophy, drama and engineering. The scholars who worked there were not mere custodians. They were supported by royal patronage, given stipends and housing, freed from financial concerns so they might dedicate themselves entirely to study, to translation, to the advancement of understanding. It was perhaps the first true research institution, a place where inquiry itself was the primary occupation, where the production of new knowledge was valued as highly as the preservation of old. And they produced remarkable work in those halls. Euclid may have developed his geometric principles there, organizing mathematical knowledge into a systematic framework that would dominate the field for 2 millennia. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth with astonishing accuracy, using geometry and observations of shadows at different latitudes. Aristarchus proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system 17 centuries before Copernicus would receive credit for the same insight. The library was not merely a repository, it was an engine of discovery. The organization of such a vast collection required innovation. The head librarians, figures like Zenodotus and Callimachus, developed systematic cataloging methods. Callimachus created the Pinaches. Effectively, the first library catalog, a 120-volume index organizing works by subject and author, providing plot summaries and biographical information, establishing standards for citation and attribution that echo through the modern scholarship. It was an extraordinary intellectual achievement in its own right. The recognition that access requires order, that a collection ungoverned by systematic organization becomes unusable regardless of its richness. But Alexandria was not alone in recognizing the value of gathered knowledge. across the Mediterranean. In Pergamon, another Hellenistic kingdom was building its own great library, creating a rivalry that drove both institutions to greater heights of acquisition and scholarship. When the Ptolemies attempted to restrict the export of papyrus to handicap their competitors, Pergamon responded by developing parchment, treated animal skin that proved more durable than papyrus, a technological innovation driven by the competition for intellectual supremacy. In Rome, as the Republic gave way to empire, wealthy citizens began assembling private libraries, recognizing that a collection of Greek and Latin texts signaled cultural sophistication, intellectual seriousness, participation in the broader world of learning, and eventually, Rome would establish public libraries, institutions funded by the state and open to citizens, the first in the Western world to embrace the concept that access to knowledge should extend beyond the wealthy elite. The idea traveled, evolved, adapted to different cultures and needs. In ancient China, imperial libraries preserved classical texts and historical records, employing scholar officials to maintain and interpret the collections. Confucian emphasis on learning and the examination system created deep respect for books and the institutions that housed them. Though natural disasters and political upheavals would repeatedly destroy these collections, the commitment to rebuilding them remained constant. The recognition that continuity of culture depended upon continuity of access to foundational texts. The Great Library at Alexandria met an end that remains contested and unclear. Not a single catastrophic event, but likely a gradual decline. Fires during Julius Caesar's siege, budget cuts under later Roman rule, the rise of Christianity and deliberate destruction of pagan texts eventually grew. The physical structure may have been damaged or destroyed during the Muslim conquest, though by then the collection itself had long since dispersed or deteriorated. What remains clear is the loss, the absence, the countless works that existed in single copies, plays by Sophocles and Euripides that we know existed only through references in surviving texts, scientific treatises, historical accounts, poetry, philosophy, gone. But the idea survived. The concept that knowledge could and should be gathered or organized, preserved, made accessible, it would resurface again and again throughout history, adapting to new technologies and social structures, but always maintaining that core recognition that human understanding advances through accumulation, through building upon the work of previous generations, through maintaining institutional memory that transcends individual mortality. In the Islamic world, as Europe entered its medieval period, a new golden age of learning emerged. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, established in the early 9th century, became a center of translation and scholarship, where texts in Greek, Persian, Sanskrit were rendered into Arabic, where scholars from different religious and cultural backgrounds collaborated on projects of mathematical, astronomical, and medical research, where the works of Aristotle and Galen and Euclid found new life and commentary. The Abbasid caliphs who sponsored this institution understood something their European counterparts would not fully grasp for centuries, that investment in learning produced returns that military conquest alone could not, that a civilization's greatness could be measured by its intellectual achievements as much as by its territorial extent. And so they gathered scholars, provided resources, created an environment where inquiry flourished. The manuscripts produced in Baghdad and other centers of Islamic learning were themselves works of art. Calligraphy elevated to extraordinary levels of skill and beauty, illuminations and geometric decorations that transformed the page into visual poetry. The physical book became an object worthy of reverence, a vessel for knowledge, but also a demonstration of the civilization's aesthetic and technical achievements. These collections grew, spread across the Islamic world. In Cordoba, the Umayyad library reportedly held 400,000 volumes, a collection that rivaled ancient Alexandria. In Cairo, in Damascus, in countless other cities, institutions dedicated to learning gathered texts, supported scholars, created networks of intellectual exchange that spanned continents, and slowly, gradually, knowledge began flowing back into Europe. Through Spain, where Islamic and Christian scholars lived in proximity, through Sicily, through returning crusaders and traveling merchants, Latin translations of Arabic translations of Greek texts, sometimes with added Arabic commentary that enriched or challenged the original arguments. The West rediscovering its own classical heritage through the patient preservation work of scholars who had maintained and built upon that heritage, while Europe struggled through political fragmentation and economic decline. The medieval European monastery played a crucial role in this preservation. In scriptoria, monk scribes spent hours each day copying manuscripts by hand, religious texts primarily, but also classical works deemed valuable or compatible with Christian teaching. It was painstaking work. A single book might take months to complete. Every letter formed carefully, illuminations added with mineral pigments and gold leaf, and each completed volume represented not just text preserved, but labor offered as devotion, the work of copying understood as a form of prayer. Monastery libraries were often small by ancient standards, perhaps a few hundred volumes, but they represented continuity. Scattered repositories that collectively preserved fragments of classical learning through centuries when centralized institutions were rare, and the monastic tradition of study, of lectio divina and scholarly commentary, kept alive the practice of careful reading, close analysis, the recognition that texts rewarded sustained attention and contemplation. Cathedral schools and early universities began emerging in the 12th and 13th centuries, creating new demand for texts, new centers where books were needed, where students and masters required access to canonical works in theology, law, medicine, philosophy, and this demand stimulated the development of commercial book production. Scriptoria, operating not as devotional practice, but as business, creating the infrastructure that would make possible an even more revolutionary transformation in how knowledge was preserved and disseminated. The invention that changed everything arrived not with fanfare, but with the practical concerns of a German goldsmith seeking a more efficient way to produce indulgences. Johannes Gutenberg's printing press, developed in the 1440s, transformed the relationship between knowledge and accessibility in ways that would ripple forward through centuries. What had required months of careful hand copying could now be reproduced in days with consistency, with accuracy, and in quantities previously unimaginable. The first substantial book printed with movable type was a Bible. The page is remarkably beautiful, designed to mimic the finest manuscript work so that early buyers might not even realize they were purchasing something mechanically produced. But the implications extended far beyond religious texts. Suddenly, the works of Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy could be produced in editions of hundreds, distributed across Europe, standardized in a way manuscripts never were, every copy of a printed book identical to every other, creating the possibility of shared reference, of scholars in distant cities working from exactly the same text. Within 50 years of Gutenberg's innovation, printing presses operated in more than 200 European cities, producing perhaps 20 million books. The speed of adoption speaks to the hunger that existed, the pent-up demand for access to texts that had been artificially scarce. And as books became more available, as prices dropped, the audience expanded, literacy rates began rising, and with them the potential readership for new ideas, controversial ideas, ideas that challenged established authority. The library as institution had to adapt to this new abundance. Collections that had been measured in hundreds now aspired to thousands, then tens of thousands. The challenge shifted from preservation of rare texts to selection, organization, management of ever-growing holdings. And new kinds of libraries emerged to serve different purposes, different constituencies. University libraries expanded dramatically. Oxford's Bodleian Library, established in the early 17th century, implemented a radical policy. It would attempt to collect everything published, at least everything published in England, through legal deposit requirements. Publishers were obligated to provide copies of new books, ensuring comprehensive collection of the nation's printed output. The ambition was extraordinary: to create a complete record of English intellectual and literary production, generation after generation, and the reading room itself became a space designed for contemplation and study. High ceilings, tall windows admitting natural light, long tables where scholars could spread out materials, request volumes from the stacks, spend hours or days immersed in research. Silence enforced not by stern librarians, but by mutual understanding among readers that this was a place for concentration, for the deep focus required by difficult texts, for the slow accumulation of understanding that comes only through sustained engagement. In France, the Bibliothèque Mazarine opened to scholars in the 1640s, followed by the Royal Library, which would eventually become the Bibliothèque Nationale. These were not merely repositories, but statements of national ambition, assertions that a great nation required great institutions of learning, that the collection and organization of knowledge reflected the sophistication of the state itself. Private libraries flourished among the wealthy, elaborate rooms lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes, purchased sometimes for their content, but often for their appearance. Books as markers of status and cultivation, yet even these collections, assembled partly for show, contributed to the broader ecosystem of preservation, and many would eventually be donated or bequeathed to institutions, becoming public resources. The 18th century brought the Enlightenment, and with it a new conception of the library's social role. Knowledge was increasingly understood not as the privileged domain of clergy and aristocracy, but as a public good, essential to the functioning of civil society, to the education of citizens, to the advancement of reason and progress. and so the movement toward public libraries gained momentum. Benjamin Franklin established a subscription library in Philadelphia in 1731. Members paid fees to support the collection and in return gained borrowing privileges. It was a modest beginning, but represented a crucial shift. The idea that ordinary citizens, tradesmen, and merchants should have access to books, that reading and self-education were not frivolous luxuries but essential components of civic participation and personal advancement. In Britain, the push for true public libraries, funded by taxation and free to all residents, gained strength through the 19th century. Advocates argued that providing working people with access to books would reduce social problems, encourage self-improvement, create a more informed and rational populace. The Public Libraries Act of 1850 allowed municipalities to levy taxes for library establishment, though adoption was gradual, meeting resistance from those who questioned whether public funds should support what they viewed as entertainment. But the libraries that emerged from this movement were remarkable spaces, often grand buildings designed to inspire respect for learning, entrance halls with vaulted ceilings, reading rooms with rows of wooden tables and brass lamps, children's sections bright and welcoming, reference departments staffed by librarians trained in the new science of library classification and service. These were democratic institutions in the truest sense, places where anyone could enter, request materials, spend the day reading, free from obligation to purchase or justify their presence. Andrew Carnegie's philanthropy accelerated this movement dramatically. Between 1883 and 1929, Carnegie funded the construction of more than 1,600 libraries across the English-speaking world. The buildings followed certain principles. They should be impressive but not intimidating, clearly marked as public spaces, designed to welcome rather than exclude. And Carnegie insisted that communities demonstrate commitment by providing the land and promising to fund operations. His money would build the structure, but the community had to sustain the institution. The Carnegie libraries that rose in small towns and large cities shared design elements, often classical revival architecture, broad steps leading to columned entrances, high windows, separate reading rooms for adults and children, and they became community anchors, places where immigrants learned English, where children discovered books their parents could never afford to buy, where self-taught scholars pursued education, where the democratization of knowledge became tangible reality. Classification systems evolved to manage growing collections. Melville Dewey's decimal classification, developed in 1876, provided a framework for organizing all human knowledge into 10 main classes, subdivided decimally to allow infinite specificity. A book about the French Revolution would be found at 944.04, always, in every library using the system, creating standardization that made research across institutions possible. The order was logical, learnable, a tool that transformed libraries from mysterious repositories requiring expert guides into systems that users could navigate independently. The card catalog became the primary access point, wooden cabinets with hundreds of narrow drawers, each containing alphabetically arranged cards, author cards, title cards, subject cards, all referencing the same books from different angles. The physicality of the catalog was satisfying. The weight of the wooden drawer sliding open, the feel of flipping through cards, the small triumph of finding exactly what you sought, and the serendipity of discovering something unexpected while searching. Librarians themselves professionalized, developing training programs, ethical codes, standards of practice. The stereotype of the stern shushing librarian obscured the reality of skilled information professionals who understood classification systems, reference techniques, collection development, preservation methods, who could guide researchers to obscure materials, answer complex questions, connect people with the resources they needed. The good librarian was part detective, part teacher, part guardian of access. Special collections emerged within larger libraries, rare book rooms with climate control and security measures, manuscript departments preserving letters and papers of significant figures, archives maintaining institutional records and historical documents. These spaces operated under different rules. Materials often could not be borrowed, had to be used in supervised reading rooms, handled with cotton gloves, but they ensured preservation of the unique items while still allowing scholarly access. The great national libraries expanded continuously. The British Library, the Library of Congress, the Bibliothèque Nationale, collections reaching into the millions of volumes, employing hundreds of staff, occupying multiple buildings, developing specialized departments for maps, music, newspapers, photographs, every format and subject area, becoming research resources of incomparable depth, destinations for scholars from around the world, pursuing questions that required access to comprehensive holdings. The Library of Congress, established in 1800 and initially destroyed when the British burned Washington during the War of 1812, was rebuilt through the purchase of Thomas Jefferson's personal library. 6,500 volumes reflecting his wide-ranging interests in history, science, philosophy, literature, law. This foundation established the library's ambition to collect comprehensively across all subjects, and as it grew, as copyright deposit laws directed copies of every American publication to its shelves, it became one of the world's great repositories, a research library serving Congress, but also the nation, eventually humanity. Reading rooms in these grand libraries were designed to inspire. The main reading room of the Library of Congress, completed in 1897, featured a dome rising 160 feet above the floor, elaborate decorations celebrating human achievement, statues of figures representing different fields of knowledge, long mahogany desks arranged in concentric circles, each with a reading lamp. The space itself argued for the nobility of scholarship, the importance of the work being done within those walls. Branch libraries extended the reach of these institutions into neighborhoods, small buildings, or even rooms in schools and community centers. Collections selected for local needs and interests, children's programming, literacy classes, meeting spaces for community groups. These were the democratic roots of the library system, the daily proof that access to knowledge was a right, not a privilege, that every community, regardless of wealth, deserved resources for learning and growth. The 20th century brought transformations that would have seemed like fantasy to earlier generations of librarians, technologies that changed not just how libraries operated, but what they fundamentally were, what they could offer, what role they played in the landscape of human knowledge. Microfilm emerged in the 1930s as a solution to preservation challenges, newspapers deteriorating on acidic paper, rare books too fragile for regular handling, bulky runs of periodicals consuming scarce shelf space. All could be photographed onto compact reels, stored in controlled environments, made accessible without risking the originals. Researchers learned to thread film onto readers, scroll through pages projected on small screens, a different experience than holding paper, but one that democratized access to materials that might otherwise be restricted. After the Second World War, a surge in higher education enrollment, fueled by programs like the GI Bill, created unprecedented demand for academic library resources. Universities expanded their collections aggressively, hired specialized librarians, built new facilities with open stacks allowing students to browse freely. The library became the intellectual heart of campus, the place where learning happened outside the classroom, where independent research began, where students discovered pathways into their disciplines. Photocopy technology, widely adopted by the 1960s, transformed research practices. Instead of laboriously transcribing passages, scholars could reproduce pages, build personal files of materials gathered from multiple sources. The implications for copyright and publishing would take decades to fully work out, but the immediate effect was to accelerate the pace of research, to enable forms of comparative analysis that required simultaneous access to numerous texts. Interlibrary loan networks expanded dramatically, enabled by improved cataloging standards and communication technologies. A book unavailable at one institution could be requested from another, shipped, borrowed for a limited period, returned. Researchers in small colleges gained access to materials held only at major universities. Scholars anywhere could pursue questions requiring obscure sources. The collective resources of the library system became, in theory, if not always smoothly in practice, available to any serious researcher. Computerization arrived gradually, initially in back-office operations, catalog records converted to machine-readable format, circulation systems tracking loans and returns electronically, inventory management, acquisitions, all the administrative functions that kept libraries operating. The transition required enormous effort. Decades of catalog cards representing millions of items had to be converted to digital records, standardized, entered into databases, but the potential was evident. Computers could search and sort and correlate in ways impossible with physical systems. The Online Public Access Catalog, the OPAC, began replacing card catalogs in the 1980s. Terminals, where users could search the collection by author, title, subject, keyword, Boolean operators allowing complex queries, finding all books by a particular author on a specific topic published after a certain year, searches that would have required consulting multiple card drawers and cross-referencing entries, now completed in seconds, and the catalog could show not just whether the library owned an item, but whether it was currently available, where it was located, when it was due back if checked out. But something was lost in the transition. The serendipity of the card catalog, the adjacent cards noticed while searching for a specific entry, the handwritten annotations librarians sometimes added, the physical trace of use, worn cards for popular items, the sensory experience of working with a tangible system, these became nostalgia, memories of a way of doing things that seemed charmingly antiquated, even to those who had relied upon it. The Internet arrived not as library technology, but as something parallel, potentially competitive. Suddenly, information was available outside institutional frameworks. Anyone with network access could find facts, read news, communicate with others. The early utopian rhetoric suggested libraries might become obsolete. Why maintain expensive buildings and collections when everything would soon be digitized and freely available online? But librarians understood what enthusiasts sometimes missed, that information abundance creates its own challenges, that findability and reliability are not guaranteed by mere availability, that curation and organization remain essential, that not everything would be digitized, not everything should be, that physical materials and digital resources could coexist, serving different needs, different uses. The shift toward digital collections accelerated through the 1990s and into the new millennium. Academic journals moving online, databases of articles searchable from any networked computer, ebooks emerging as an alternative format, though adoption remained slower than predicted. Digitization projects like Google Books attempting to scan millions of volumes, creating searchable full-text repositories, raising complex questions about copyright and access and preservation, libraries adapted by becoming hybrid spaces, physical collections supplemented by licensed digital resources, reference librarians helping users navigate both print indices and online databases, computer terminals joining reading tables, Wi-Fi networks enabling researchers to bring their own devices. The library building transformed from being primarily a warehouse for books into a multifunctional learning and community space. Public libraries especially embraced this expanded role, offering not just books but internet access for those without home connections, digital literacy training, job search assistance, meeting rooms for community groups, programming for children and teens, maker spaces with three-dimensional printers and recording equipment, homework, help, and ESL classes. The library became a democratic technology center, an educational hub. A third place, neither home nor work, where people could gather, learn, access resources and opportunities. The physical book persisted despite predictions of its demise. Readers discovered that different formats suited different purposes. Ebooks convenient for travel. Physical books preferred for sustained reading, for books meant to be kept and reread, for the pleasure of browsing shelves. And libraries continued acquiring both, balancing user preferences with budget constraints, preservation responsibilities with demand for new materials, challenges mounted, budgets stagnating or declining even as costs increased. Journal subscriptions consuming ever larger portions of academic library budgets, forcing cancellations, limiting access, public libraries facing pressure to demonstrate value in quantifiable terms, circulation statistics and program attendance becoming measures of success in ways that perhaps missed the less tangible but equally important roles libraries played. Yet the fundamental purpose remained: connecting people with knowledge, with information, with stories and ideas, and the accumulated understanding of human culture. The formats changed, the technologies evolved, the specific services adapted to community needs, but the core mission persisted across millennia. From clay tablets in Mesopotamian palace archives to digitized manuscripts accessible from anywhere with internet connection, the library endured as an institution dedicated to preservation, organization, access, and in an age of information overload, when search engines return millions of results in milliseconds, when anyone can publish anything online without editorial oversight or fact-checking, when algorithmic recommendations create filter bubbles and echo chambers, the library's curatorial function gained new relevance. Librarians as guides through information chaos, helping users evaluate sources, distinguish reliable from unreliable, develop critical literacy skills essential for navigating the contemporary information landscape. Special collections and archives found new audiences through digitization, rare manuscripts viewable online by researchers who could never visit in person, historical photographs discoverable through keyword searches, oral history recordings preserved and made accessible. The work of digitization, labor-intensive and expensive, requiring careful handling of fragile materials, high-resolution scanning, metadata creation, but resulting in dramatic expansion of who could access these unique resources. Indigenous communities and former colonies began reclaiming knowledge, seeking return of cultural materials held in distant libraries, or at a minimum requesting consultation and shared stewardship, raising important questions about ownership, about whose stories get told and who controls access, about the colonial histories embedded in many great collections, challenging institutions to examine their practices and relationships with source communities. The library building itself remained important, not as the sole point of access, but as physical manifestation of community commitment to learning, to literacy, to democratic values. The Carnegie libraries that had served small towns for a century needed updating. Some were renovated, repurposed, a few, sadly, demolished, but many communities fought to preserve them, recognizing them as architectural landmarks and symbols of civic pride. New library buildings incorporated design elements addressing contemporary needs, flexible spaces that could be reconfigured, technology infrastructure built into the architecture, accessibility for users with disabilities, sustainable building practices, natural light and comfortable seating, cafes and group study rooms, acknowledging that learning is often social, sound-dampened quiet zones for those needing silence, attempts to create welcoming environments that serve diverse user populations and multiple purposes simultaneously. The librarian's role continued evolving, traditional skills in cataloging and reference work, supplemented by expertise in digital resources, data management, information literacy instruction, community engagement, scholarly communication, the profession requiring continuous learning, adaptation to new technologies and changing user needs, while maintaining core commitments to intellectual freedom, privacy, equitable access, principles that took on new urgency in digital contexts where surveillance and data collection were ubiquitous. And through all these changes, through format shifts and technological disruption, through budget crises and existential questions about relevance, libraries persisted, adapted, found ways to remain essential to the communities they served, because the need they addressed was fundamental, the human hunger for knowledge, for stories, for connection to ideas and to each other through the medium of a shared culture. These needs transcended any particular technology or format, any specific organizational system or service model. The question was never whether libraries would survive, but how they would evolve, what forms they would take, what services they would offer. And the answer emerged through experimentation, through listening to communities, through librarians' creativity and commitment, through recognition that the institution's strength lay not in any single function, but in its adaptability, its capacity to meet changing needs while maintaining fidelity to enduring values. The deeper pattern reveals itself slowly, like a constellation emerging as eyes adjust to darkness. Libraries have never been merely buildings filled with books. They have been theaters of transformation, spaces where individuals encounter ideas that reshape understanding, where communities maintain continuity across generations, where the possible expands beyond the boundaries of immediate experience. Consider what happens in the silence of sustained reading, the peculiar intimacy of engaging with another mind across distance, across time, the author perhaps long dead, the reader not yet born when the words were written. Yet in the act of reading, a connection forms. Thoughts conceived in one consciousness reconstitute themselves in another, not perfectly, never identically, but recognizably, meaningfully, and the library is the vessel that makes this encounter possible. The architecture of knowledge takes unexpected forms, the way subjects once considered separate reveal connections, mathematics illuminating music theory, biology informing philosophy, poetry capturing truths that elude scientific description, and the library organized by classification schemes, by subject headings and call numbers, paradoxically enables these discoveries, because proximity on shelves creates adjacencies in thought. The browser seeking one book notices another, follows an unexpected thread, emerges hours later having learned something they did not know they wanted to understand. There is democracy in alphabetical order, in systems that organize by topic rather than by the status of authors, in open stacks where anyone can wander, retrieve materials without intermediary. The physical act of pulling a book from a shelf, a small assertion of intellectual agency, the choice to engage, to pursue curiosity, to grant oneself permission to learn, and libraries multiply these moments millions of times over. Quiet affirmations that knowledge belongs to whoever seeks it. The preservation function operates on temporal scales difficult for individuals to comprehend. Librarians today making decisions about what future generations will have access to, which voices will be heard a century hence, which perspectives preserved, which allowed to fade. The responsibility is profound, the choices consequential, and yet must be made. Budgets are finite, space limited, selection inevitable. And so the work proceeds with as much care and foresight as can be mustered, knowing that some part of the present will become invisible to the future despite best efforts. Digital preservation presents challenges even more complex than conserving paper and ink. File formats become obsolete, software unreadable on new systems, websites disappear, entire archives evaporating when servers fail or companies cease operations. The paradox that information in the most technologically advanced formats may prove least durable over centuries, while medieval manuscripts on vellum remain readable after half a millennium. The solutions require ongoing active maintenance, migration from old formats to new, redundant storage, institutional commitment across decades, work that must continue indefinitely or risk catastrophic loss. The social space of libraries matters in ways not fully captured by circulation statistics. The student who has no quiet place to study at home, finding sanctuary in the reading room. The elderly patron who comes primarily for human contact, brief friendly exchanges with staff, the presence of others engaged in their own pursuits, the homeless individual seeking shelter and dignity in a space that offers both without demanding anything in return, the library as refuge, as third place, as location where one can simply be without commercial transaction or social obligation. Children's relationship with libraries often forms early and stays deeply rooted. The excitement of getting a first library card, name written in careful letters, the power it represents, access to thousands of books, the freedom to choose, to take them home, story hours where librarians read aloud, voices animated, children sprawled on carpet, transported by narrative, summer reading programs, the joy of selecting armfuls of books, the weight of possibility, and sometimes, for some children, the library becomes the place where love of reading takes hold, where worlds beyond immediate circumstances become visible, imaginable, where futures other than predetermined paths suggest themselves. The reference interview, that conversational dance between librarian and patron, reveals human dimension of information seeking, the question asked often not quite the question meant, the skilled librarian listening beneath the words, clarifying, suggesting, understanding that information need is rarely simple retrieval, more often a complex negotiation with uncertainty, a groping toward understanding not yet fully formed. And the good librarian helps navigate that uncertainty, offers pathways, resources, next steps, without judgment, without assumption, meeting the questioner where they are. Academic libraries witness the formation of expertise. Undergraduate students learning to move beyond textbooks and lectures into primary sources, grappling with scholarly discourse, beginning to contribute their own ideas. Graduate students spending years in carols and reading rooms, developing arguments, marshalling evidence. The dissertation that represents original contribution to knowledge often built from countless hours among the stacks. And the library holds all of this, the finished scholarship and the process, the published works and the archival materials that document how understanding advances through patient accumulation. Special collections preserve the ephemeral, letters and diaries, drafts and revisions, the working materials that show how creation actually happens, the false starts and crossed out lines, and these materials humanize the canonical, show writers and thinkers as people who struggled, who doubted, whose finished works represent choices among possibilities, and researchers in these collections often seek not just information but connection, intimacy with the creative process, insight into how ideas develop. Indigenous knowledge traditions pose important questions about library practices. Oral cultures where knowledge lives in performance and relationship, where context and ceremony matter, where some knowledge is restricted, not meant for general access, and Western library models built on principles of universal access and permanent preservation sometimes clash with these epistemologies, requiring institutions to develop new approaches, collaborative practices, recognition that stewardship takes different forms, that preservation and access must sometimes be balanced differently. The pandemic of 2020 revealed library importance through absence. Buildings closed, physical materials inaccessible, and while many services moved online, digital reference and virtual programming and expanded ebook lending, something essential was lost. The place itself, the browsing, the chance encounters, the public computing, the after-school programs, the simple opportunity to be among others in a shared space dedicated to learning, and the eagerness with which communities returned when reopening became possible spoke to needs libraries meet that extend beyond information provision. Banned books and challenges to materials reveal ongoing tensions about library values, intellectual freedom, clashing with desires to protect or control what others, especially children, encounter, librarians defending principles of access, arguing that exposure to diverse perspectives strengthens rather than threatens, that individuals and families can make their own choices without imposing restrictions on others. The library as battleground for competing visions of what society should be, what knowledge should be available, who decides looking across millennia. From clay tablets to digital databases, the continuity seems more significant than the changes. Yes, technologies transform, scales shift, access expands, but the fundamental human activities remain: seeking knowledge, preserving understanding, organizing information, making it findable, connecting people with ideas. These impulses ancient as civilization itself, and likely to persist as long as humans wonder, question, desire to know. The future remains uncertain. Artificial intelligence and machine learning promising and threatening disruption, questions about library roles, when algorithms can retrieve information, when chatbots can answer questions. But the wise remember that technology has always posed such challenges, and libraries have always adapted, found new ways to remain relevant, because the core need is human, the hunger for understanding, for growth, for connection to accumulated wisdom, and these needs transcend any particular technological moment. Perhaps what libraries ultimately preserve is possibility, the possibility that anyone, regardless of background or circumstance, might encounter an idea that transforms understanding, might discover a passion, might develop expertise, might contribute to the ongoing conversation that is human culture. The library says, in its existence, in its openness, that this possibility is worth protecting, worth investing in, worth maintaining for generation after generation, a faith in human potential, in the value of learning, in the importance of memory and access, and the free circulation of ideas. And so the work continues. Librarians cataloging new acquisitions, shelvers returning books to their proper places, reference specialists answering questions, archivists processing collections, preserving fragile materials, all in service of something larger than any individual, in service of the collective project of maintaining and extending human understanding, of ensuring that what we have learned, created, discovered, is not lost, but carried forward, made available, offered to whoever comes seeking. The buildings stand, some grand, some modest, some centuries old, some newly constructed, but all serving similar purposes, providing space for quiet concentration, for research and discovery, for learning and growth. Doorways open, welcoming, public in the deepest sense, belonging to everyone, excluding no one, asking nothing but curiosity, respect, the willingness to engage, and inside the volumes wait, millions of them, Billions. Knowledge accumulated across millennia. Stories and data. Poetry and science. History and speculation. Voices of the famous and forgotten. All held. All organized. All theoretically accessible to whoever takes the time to look, to search, to follow threads of interest wherever they lead. It is an extraordinary gift, this inheritance, built by countless individuals across generations who believed that knowledge mattered, that preservation served the future, that access should be protected, defended, expanded whenever possible, who did the unglamorous work, the cataloging and conservation, the reference service and collection development, because they understood themselves as links in a chain extending backward to ancient Alexandria and forward to generations unborn. The library endures, adapting, evolving, meeting new challenges, embracing new possibilities, but always maintaining fidelity to core purposes, always serving those fundamental human needs that transcend era or technology, the need to know, to remember, to learn from those who came before, to imagine what might come after, and in that endurance, in that persistence across centuries of change, there is something profoundly hopeful, a statement of faith in human curiosity, in the value of learning, in the possibility of understanding, in the importance of maintaining spaces, physical and institutional, where knowledge can be freely sought, freely shared, freely given to all who hunger for it. The silence of the reading room, the rustle of turn-in pages, the soft keyboard clicks, the whispered question at the reference desk. These sounds of minds at work, engaged, seeking, all part of a tradition older than most institutions, more enduring than empires, the human project of gathering what we know, organizing it, preserving it, offering it forward, generation to generation, an endless conversation, a collective memory, a gift renewed with each person who enters, each question asked, each discovery made, each moment of understanding achieved in the quiet sanctuary of accumulated human wisdom.